Okay. Hello, welcome to my podcast. I'm your host, Larry Liu, and today I'm joined by Francis Cao. He's currently a law faculty or fellow at in Frankfurt, right? In the
Right,
University
right, right.
of Frankfurt. So, Francis, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much. Thank you for having me on the show.
Yeah, so we could go in any direction that we want to. So Uh, perhaps talk a little bit about your own background, your own life story, and how it all started. You grew up in China on the mainland, and then somehow you ended up in University of Pennsylvania in the U.S., and then somehow you ended up in the German legal sphere. So take us through that journey of life.
Yeah, thanks so much, like Larry. Like it's I just want to say, like, I'm so happy to talk to you, in through this kind of platform. I know it sounds a little bit weird because like the last time we met is still face to face, and that was like it's kind of interesting, to be honest. Like we had our first like this deep conversation by crushing someone else's party.
Yeah, do you want to say more about how we met each other? Maybe that's also a good introduction
Right. I
to
think
the
I
audience.
think that would be very interesting to have some kind of account about that. So like so I think we kind of like literally like bounced into one another, like in University of Amsterdam, right? Like at this law school building. Like I think it's somewhere like in the school lobby. And I think you were at that time like in front of this desk and like getting yourself some, I don't know, like some fruits. Is that the apple? And I was also there grabbing my apple. So it turns out to be this very interesting exchange about what we are doing. And right, so it happened right after the whole day session in this like conference of CESA, right? The CESA is this Association of Socioeconomic Studies. And after that, like we just really hit it off, and we got like a couple of other fellows, and like we somehow formulated this cohort with a friend of ours, like Jay Varias. Also, like I think he's now a PhD candidate at Berkeley. I think the Department of Political Science, if I get it correct. So we at that time like three of us. Also like with John Coffey. I think he's now like associate professor at University of California Riverside, and we thought like we could go out, find out a place to have some dinner, and that's the most interesting thing happened. So like I think like in academia, the things are always very how to say, like out of the serendipity. So when we were like trying to look for some restaurants, I can't till now I can't really figure out who, but someone said like there is something going on. We could join them, right? So we just like you and me, like we just like became this part of this, I don't know, community of of I don't know, made ups. And we just like went into this South Asian restaurant, right? South Asian restaurants, and it happened
Yeah,
to be this retirement party of
Gregory Jackson. He's a chief
you
editor
know,
of Socio Economic Review.
right, and I think they were nice enough to ask us to stay. Otherwise, it would be kind of awkward. So we basically shared the
But they had
table,
enough tables, right? I think they were planning for
right?
overflow possibility, right?
I guess it is. So we entered the folks, and we found ourselves like into like I don't know, in the middle of this folks. Some of them like we have known the name, some of them like we might have haven't really heard of. And yeah, and that is a occasion in which we had this conversation, and it turns out to be a great one.
And the food was
I
good too. I mean,
Yeah,
I
yeah,
would
yeah. That
definitely
that
go back
that
to the
definitely adds some
restaurant.
points. Yeah, that's just crazy. Like thinking about that, like it feels like we're like living like upon the heritage, was upon this great legacy of Gregory. I mean, right? Like I think maybe someday in future, Miguel says, "Thank you, Gregory. You made something happen."
So,
Yeah.
I mean, you've been to American Ivy League, so you know that during a lot of events like lectures, they would usually serve a meal
Right.
with that, or at least snacks. So I don't know. I should say that perhaps I'm a little bit spoiled in that regard. That I kind of take it for granted that there's supposed to be meals that come with university or academic events, but it actually turns out that this is very unusual, right? If you go to any like public university in the U.S. or
Oh
in
yeah.
any of the European countries, you'll never get anything basically.
Now, there's very interesting story that comes to me. The last time I was in UPenn, it was in 2017. I was there like for a year as a visiting scholar at law faculty, I think, like law school, and that was between 2017 2018. And together with me, there were also like another German law researcher, and he's kind of senior than me. And like what I heard from him is like after a year's stay in UPenn, he can gain like I think another like 10 kilos because of this free food. Like he participated in almost every the sessions of like speeches, like irrelevant, no matter if it is relevant to his research or not. It's just like you get free food, right? Like why not? You're not going, and like it's just like right, like it's just like very, I think, very idiosyncratic nature of this U.S. within North American academic institutions. Yeah.
Well, I mean, if you charge, $65,000 in tuition to your undergraduates, you better bloody provide some perks at the very least.
Yeah.
For if your university is entirely publicly funded, as in many European countries, I understand that they have to be stingy and reserve the scarce resources to maintenance and
Right.
bureaucracy and things like that. But
Yeah, I think that's exactly what I feel. You talked about my own resume. Yeah, it's true. Like I spent years in US, I spent years in China, mainland China, especially like Beijing. And but when I was Beijing, it was like between 2005 to 2013 or 14. I kind of something like that. I had this RM degree in Peking University, and it's a totally different kind of experience. It's I think like this education system in China is funded in a totally different like manner, and at that time there wasn't such kind of tradition of like inviting your students coming to this like classroom, having this lecture, and then you have some free food to distribute. But the I think the latest visit of me to mainland China was sometime before the pandemic. This official visit, like out of work, and I think the situation has changed a little bit. There were like things like law firms and also like big corporate sponsoring this kind of lectures. So you also have this kind of occasions in which you have this free meals, although as you know, like no meals are totally free. So it's kind of occasions. You also have this like I don't know, this speeches from who knows, God knows who they are, and it's like an interesting combination. It's like very interesting illustration of modern capitalism, how this production of knowledge, like emerge. So you get these different forces. You get money. You get scholars. You get students. You get nexus of them, and like food, it might be a very interesting medium in between. You see how this exchanges take place, and well, it's fair to say, like I think Europe is relatively late in this general trend. Right now I'm staying in Berlin for most of the time, although like I do like travel a lot to Frankfurt. I think, but in both Berlin and Frankfurt, you don't really get this free food very often, even if there are some lectures. And here is more. I think this kind of events are more projected as sort of rock star concerts, as a very inappropriate metaphor. For example, last month, one of the C1s that I happen to be part of that is this lecture by Nancy Fraser from New School, and she was supposed to give this lecture at Berlin, one of the greatest, biggest venues for this kind of speeches. And according to my knowledge, I said that was such a big venue, although we don't really charge people for the tickets, and of course there are no free meal, but there was no chance that this venue will be full. So I think we're totally safe. And so I talked to this organizing team saying that we don't need to concern about that. There's no problem going on. Come on.
With overflow capacity you're referring to?
Right. We were talking about this philosopher, right? Social serious. It's not some real rock star, right? It is going to be fine. But do you know what happened? When Nancy really came, we got this very long line of people. I think it's totally out of this capacity. So we get this 300 people outside this whole venue waiting for access. And in the end, it turns out to be a very embarrassing situation. I have to say sorry.
You have a TV screen recording, and then you
now
have
it's on YouTube.
Outside.
Now it's on YouTube. But we are not that, we were not that prepared. So we thought it wasn't that bad. So we didn't really have the streaming thing. Because streaming in any different kind of configuration. So yeah, so it turns out to be a very awkward situation. And see, that's the difference, right? In North America, you need food to attract people. In Europe, I mean, maybe the fame of a scholar is enough. I
wonder how you advertise those events in Berlin.
It's not truly advertised. That's the problem. We only pass this information among, I don't know, seminars, among professors, and we tell them there's going to be a new one. You can let your students know, you can let your friends know, and feel free to join us. And that's basically the whole thing. So I guess that will be a very interesting theme to study, how this event become this almost like a media sensation, I guess. Yeah, there were coverage by local news. They were coverage by, I don't know, whatever. It turns out to be a very big thing, something I didn't really expect.
Do you think that there's a stronger intellectual culture in Germany than what you find in the US? Because I mean, in the US, I mean, you have the elite intellectual culture for sure. I mean, they are concentrated at the top universities, and it's a really concentrated, talented pool. But there might be this idea that in Germany, intellectual culture might be a much broader phenomenon in society. I don't know. I mean, it's just...
Is that a tricky question? Are you pushing me to offend either side of them?
Well, I mean,
no, I'm kidding. I'm kidding.
You're totally free to.
I think it's a very interesting question. It's something that is confusing to me all years. I feel that it's very striking to see the differences between the two sides of this Atlantic. You have this North American side, where you have this Ivy League institutions. You have this so-called like high-ranking universities, which are better funded and have more resources than average. So of course, under this kind of circumstance, you have scholars who are always exposed under this media spectacle. And it's not surprising that in US have this people like Noam Chomsky, for example, whose fame have gone really beyond this academia in itself, right? To be honest, I think he's now more a media figure than academic. And Also, like you have this like European ways. It's I don't think like there's a difference in terms of this so-called intellectual tradition or intellectual environment, but I think there are different ways of like promoting the spread of you can say knowledge, or you can say ideologies. In Europe, it's more something that is exposed by the so-called national cultures. So, and in nowadays, it's not only like restricted to terms like Deutsche or the Französisch, La Française, something like that. It's more about some special so-called values that is almost supposed to be inherent to this so-called like this country's so-called tradition. For example, if you are going to give like this speech in Germany about exploitation, about Marxism, it seems to be something right on spot, right? It is like the birthplace of this kind of ideas. So if you have a speech like that, it's very easy for get some attention. Guess it's almost the same if you talk about human rights, like in Paris or other places. So I guess this kind of this so-called like national culture somehow is transformed into this I don't know, like if there's augmentation of this fame of this like scholars like influence in this sphere. I think if you see it from this lens, this so-called like private institution in North America can be seen as some sort of this like equivalence to that of this national cultures in like Western Europe. It's almost have the same functions, right? Like it's somehow like push this signals to be exaggerated, to be better spread across the world.
It's not just intellectual culture, because I remember, so I was in Vienna for
Mhm.
about 3 weeks, and one thing I find interesting, I mean, flipping through the local newspapers, and also even just like going to like the subway stop and looking at the advertisements that they put up. Um, I mean, of course, they have like classic, capitalistic commercials, but
Right.
but I think they were also having like opera and theater commercials, or
Mhm, mhm.
they were, oh, here you have a Mozart concert
Right, right,
taking
right.
place here. And then the same thing with the newspaper, where, okay, the first section, okay, it's national politics, then international
Mhm,
politics, and then
mhm.
business section, and then but then uh, after that, there's like a big culture section, and they would feature interviews with theater directors, with
Mhm, mhm,
filmmakers,
mhm.
and with actors. And yeah, and they would say, well, here's a full cultural program that you can attend. Now, I mean, of course, this is might be very specific to large cities, big cities, but where you can have that kind of cultural infrastructure. But I very much like that. I mean, you can find those things in the U.S. too. I mean, but
Mhm, mhm.
you'd have to actively seek it out to some extent. It might be
Right.
not as
It's somehow
obvious.
if I may intervene a little bit, but I think it somehow like relates to what we are doing right now as part of this for me it's about like legal sociology, what's it sociology like in general in this European context. For you is like sociology, I guess in North American context, we say like Anglophone context. This the recent, although may not be like recent, but the emergence of this like cultural sociology of culture, like in itself suggests this very interesting juxtaposition between so-called uh, the sociology of this like social differentiation that happened like in 1960s, and like where there's this old generation of sociologists from mostly like Europe brought this idea to Americans. and this great so-called like counter movement that happened like in 1980s and still continues till nowadays. So like for me, it's something interesting. If I stay in Europe for a period of time, I will understand the culture as a concept is something that is beyond this like so-called social differentiation. It's not like a sphere. It's something larger than that. As you put it, like it could be like multiple pages in this national newspaper, right? Like or even regional newspapers. So it suggests something larger than a part of this social functions or part of this social system, so to speak. And that's why I think like the sociology of culture has been so like trendy these years, because eventually you'll find out a thing that is beyond this like very restricted, very compartmentalized ways of doing sociology, of doing some like empirical research, because it's give you something larger than that. Although like on the other hand, like which is a point I'm trying to make here, is in a way like this so-called like the sociology of culture might derive from a very Eurocentric context, because like if you stay here, you know what's going on, you know what this culture refers to. But like if you go back to US and if you see what's going on in the US, this idea of this sociology of culture like might be a little bit conflated with other like realms of research, you know, like yeah. So it just become, I don't know, it might be a very European idea. And maybe I'm just speaking from my ass, but
Well, we do have sociology of culture scholars in the U.S. too. I mean, I think that Ann Swidler, and then also Robert Bella, and one of my retired profs here in Princeton, Robert Woodnow, one of the leading culture scholars, culture theorists, and it's a big area. I mean, I have sort of difficulty, like if you ask me on the spot, define the word culture.
Right. That's exactly what
and
I'm
I would,
saying. That's exactly
wing
what I'm
my way
saying.
around it. It's really hard to get around it, but I guess maybe norms, traditions, maybe that would probably be a way to go about it. I mean, like, if you encounter some kind of situation, as a people, within a nation state, within a village or tribal group, how do you go about, dealing with that situation? I mean, whether it's a problem, or whether it is, something less troublesome. Yeah, it's about what are the scripts. That's right.
Right.
Like, because you will encounter a certain situation, and you need to have some kind of response to it. I mean, so if you think, for instance, about this whole right to life thing, so the abortion debate that was initiated in United States, because of the Supreme Court judgment that occurred 2 months ago, Dobbs versus Jackson, and they basically pushed the decision on abortion from the federal to the state, right? So because the Roe v. Wade said that there was a federal policy to determine the right to abortion. And of course, that created the political pushback from the states where they have more conservative views on abortion. So now here the European comparison, I think, is also quite interesting. I mean, I saw an article about the lower availability of abortion providers in rural areas, like in Fallenberg and Tyrol in Austria, and then in Bavaria, Bayern in Germany. But it's very interesting because it's not that you don't have in your face kind of activism, conservative activism to say, right to fetus and so forth, as you have in America. But rather it's sort of like a quiet conservative consensus, which makes the sort of the population look down on the abortion providers, and then thereby disincentivizing doctors to provide these abortion services, and thereby creating a similar de facto anti-abortion environment as the conservative US states have done, without necessarily having those angry social media and news media acrimonious battle as you have in the US, right? And so that's what I find very interesting, where it's like actually because when you say, okay, well, you live in North America, you live in Europe, and you always like to see the differences between the two places, but here, I mean, I kind of see no. I mean, there's kind of a little consensus, right? There's like a coming together, but using maybe different different means of getting there, right? Yeah. Like I mean, as you might know, I mean, there's this varieties of capitalism literature, right? The Helen Soskich, which, I mean, I'm sure in comparative, legal studies, this issue theorem might, come up. And right, so so the debate is, whether the political economies in North America and in Europe are the same or different, and certainly within that framework of coordinated versus liberal market economies, there are certainly distinctions, and about how do you do skill formation training, what's the level of labor market protection, and so forth. So those differences definitely exist. But actually, I mean, I'm sort of influenced by people like Marx and Weber. I mean, really of the first generation of the sociologists who actually say that, no, I mean, the capitalistic economy is sort of pushing in one direction. There is, even if there's variation between the political economies, they are definitely pushing in one direction. And so, Wolfgang Streeck shares that view as well. And, he says, capitalism is N equals 1. So basically he says that there would be some kind of convergence of political economies, basically towards, you could say, more market-friendly structures. And that's the position that I take as well. So basically, similarity between the spaces.
Right. I think we're making some very, very like interesting. By interesting, I'm using in this European way, not this American way. Like back in the US, the first thing I learned is that like when I was doing my law school, like that was around like 2013 or something, not this visiting scholar thing, but the time before, I realized that like when the American professor said something like interesting, it usually means like what you're saying is mostly bullshit. Yeah, like but like it's like in European ways, like when I say something is interesting, it's really interesting. Like look, like I think you're making this I guess I can't agree more like about your very interesting like reconstruction of what is happening over time in this tradition of sociology, especially in this like German-speaking tradition, in which you have this, as we spoke the first time we met, if I remembered correctly, the tradition of Verstehen from Max Weber, from that the tradition of the status, for example, the tradition of the state, and the whole project of political economy that derives from this overview of so-called capitalist production, and it's like later version that is, as you put it, like variety of capitalism, as one of the most famous examples, in which you have more emphasizes upon distinctions, upon national characteristics, upon, I don't know, I think the end of this variety of capitalism is always about institutional design. So this whole like stream of thoughts. So like if you see it from this like chronological perspective, you may find out there are two trains of thoughts. And and if you see it from right now, right here, sometimes these two trains of thought might clash. And which brings me back to your first point. That is, I think, also like very, very like interesting. But talking about this Roe and Wade. And I'm from this like law school training. So, I mean, in the last couple of years, when I hear about something like Roe versus Wade, about like US Supreme Court, my first almost like intuitive response is about this like interpretive like technique. It's about the history of this like legal series, and how this technique can be repurposed in the new context, which I guess is wise of this law school training, because that's something you're trained to think, to project, to figure out a way of like articulating it. But now it's like, as a hindsight, like seeing from where I'm standing right now, I think what you mentioned, like in this recent debate about like Roe versus Wade, about like the substantial like substantial due process, which is one of the theories that this U.S. Supreme Court has referred to. It speaks of this relationship between norm, as you correctly speak of, and also like this tendency, we'll say like this tradition of decentralization, which is, I think, like if you talk about constitutional theories, like in US, that is something very characteristic, because if you look at this like interesting comparative studies about what's happening at the second half of 18th century in Europe, most of stories about constitutive power from CS, from French Revolution, that derives from the tradition of national sovereignty, by which a country in itself is seen as one. There's no possible ways of like looking at a state, so-called a sovereign state, in late 18th century like context, to project as some kind of like combination, so to speak, of states and federals. Like that will be crazy if you talk to someone like in late 18th century France, especially like in Paris.
France is a very centralized political structure, right?
Exactly. And also like if you see the context of French Revolution, like one of the most imminent pressure of that time is trying to eradicate all kinds of federal residues in that country. That means you have to throw away all kind of this like so-called like state in US context that is like delegated power to regional and also like municipal like polities. So if you take that look, and if you go back to US by the end of 18th century, you will see this federalism is a very interesting, was idiosyncratic like configuration. You have this whole setting where the federal level have this kind of like power that is not only derived from the revolution against this so-called feudal residues in US. It might not be the case. It might be no federal feudal residues, which is arguable. I mean, but also like you have this interesting compromise between so-called like federal government and also like state government. And this kind of, you can say it's a matter of space. You can say it's a matter of like decentralization. That depends on what kind of like sociological tradition you subscribe to. But that is like, for me, indeed one of the most like fascinating features of like US so-called like political like stuff. And if you see that and combine with what's going on like in Supreme Court discussions, you see how norm is generated in this process. Till now, it's still about like whether state have the right to regulate, let's say to, like in US law terms, is police, which is interesting. The police power has a right to police things like the right to choose, let's say the right to life. And that is, I mean, a very interesting, like for me, it's an interesting configuration of constitution. It's not literally about the difference between the US and Europe. And like, I think like I really learned from your example, which I think is perfectly interesting. You see, like this kind of the decentralization thing happens almost everywhere, right? Like also like in Europe, you also get the side of things where like in the local level, we say like in the state level, you get this counter-revolutionary, you get counter-revolutionaries, you got people who argue for something different. And that thing, if you see that from the perspective of the sui generis norms, that actually creates this very interesting pushback to this top-down norm creation. It's a non-general, like top-down approach. There is this kind of like a quite different approach, but goes from bottom up.
Yeah, so I mean, isn't there this conflict between norm and procedure? So because the anti-abortion, the pro-life crowd is drawing on this argument of procedure, that is to say, we want state power and not federal power, in order to realize the normative vision, which is, you know, the pro-life stance. And I mean, it sort of reminds me of in American history, the treatment of slavery, right? So, the same, you know, you could say, anti-federal logic was being used, right? Where you say, procedurally, we want the states to regulate slavery, and not for the national government to make that determination. And that's what the subject of the Civil War, in the 1860s, was. That this kind of you know, constitutional tension that comes from basically the normative versus the, you know, the procedural. Yeah, that conflict could sort of no longer be suppressed. It had to be eventually fought over, and yeah, with, you know, with soldiers rather than with lawyers.
Right.
And so I don't think that we are at precisely that stage yet. I still, I'm very confident that, you know, with, you know, because abortion is one among many issues that people are concerned about, right? So you have to always pick your battles wisely, as the famous saying goes. And you know, if since the Roe v. Wade, I mean, you know, there's basically 50 years of you know, pro-life legal activism, and my prediction would be that now that the tides are going to shift somewhat. That is to say, the pro-lifers are going to lean back a little bit because they attained their objective, and the pro-choice legal camp is going to try to go on the offense. And I mean, the question is, I mean, how successful are they going to be with that? 63 conservative majority in the Supreme Court. Would you have to, maybe conduct a litigation, perhaps at the state level first, perhaps with some, federal or state level judges that are more favorable to the pro-choice side. And so that's sort of what my anticipation was. And then I wanted to bring in another point, so that goes even before the Civil War in America. Because you just presented the outcome of the constitutional struggle, which is to balance the federal and the state power, which is not. I mean, it is mostly accurate, but I think the asterisk is that there's a little bit more power for the federal government. Because if you recall, so the Articles of Confederation, I believe it was 1781 or something, but it definitely preceded the current U.S. Constitution. And in the Articles of Confederation, the most of the power, which I guess in the early days, I guess it was about raising an army and taxes, mostly
taxation.
It would be relegated to the states under the Articles of Confederation. And then for some reason, because they had trouble paying the debt, and then they were still fighting the English for the War of Independence, and so they said, okay, so we're gonna have to amend these Articles of Confederation, and then they drafted the U.S. Constitution. That I think I mean, I'm not a legal scholar at all, but my impression was that the supremacy clause of the Constitution, which says that that federal that you would leave a lot of affairs to the states, but if there ever was a clash between federal and state law, the federal law is above the state law, which is, I mean, of course, and you could use that provision in Roe v. Wade, right, or in the whatever 13th Amendment to abolish slavery and things like that, right? So I think it's important to say that in the American constitutional design, that yes, there's a balance between federal and state, but there is the supremacy clause too, right? Which is important. The federal stands above the state.
And there's a tension. There's always a tension, and that tension somehow evolves into the scenario we are currently looking at. And then, like, I to be honest, I like it's a great conversation. Like I think I'm now like into my mood. It's just a great conversation, because like you mentioned this interesting like distinctions between norms and procedures, and it somehow like relates to one of my most famous like colleagues in Frankfurt, Jürgen Habermas, and the critiques on his theory that follows. Like one of the apex of Habermas, like his general like works, but span across his like decades of writing, is about the importance, or say the centrality of discourse, centrality of rational discourse in his like in so-called like human activities. So for Habermas, he basically situated this whole so-called discursive rationality into so-called the making of modern political and in his later works, economic order. So he believes that like there's, in terms of this like conflicts, in terms of this contradictions in our societal processes, and like also like realms, it is possible for Habermas to find out, was it to figure out this kind of procedural solutions, or at least a procedural way out of this current like scenario. So by doing that, like he actually kind of put this procedural solution a little bit higher than this normative solutions. So like I think for him, he had this very deep commitment, but eventually all of this so-called like unresolved conflict will be somehow like resolved through this so-called like procedural sightings. And that is where his very political writings, for example, his writings about UN reform, his writings about Europe, like Europe for European something, like come from. And later there were a lot of critiques about this procedural like approach. For example, like a lot of my colleagues, like younger generations of the so-called Frankfurt Schule, I think they're right. They're right by looking at this like deficiency, what's it, the shortcomings of this procedural approach. One of the most like significant deficiencies of this approach is actually a part of this ignorance of the normative, because you can't really hide the conflicts. You can't really hide the contradictions, even under this unities of these like rational discourses. So eventually, at the end of the day, this kind of attention will emerge. But that's so-called like real contradictions.
I just want to add one more variable. So it's not just norms about, what I believe to be right or wrong versus what you believe to be right or wrong, but power is the key variable. So that is to say, there's inequality in power, where I mean, so I want to cite the very famous Princeton political science study by Gillens and Page, which says that the lower 7 deciles of the income distribution, basically the poorest 70% of Americans, have virtually no influence over the policymaking processes in the United States Senate. And the way to test that hypothesis is basically to distribute a survey to the population. I mean, and then ask them, of course, for their income level, and then you figure out, I mean, whether the preferences get met. So for the policies where everybody agrees, regardless of income, those policies get passed. On the policies where only the rich are in favor of it, it gets passed. And then in the policies where only the poor are in favor of it, it doesn't get passed. So that's how you can determine the influence that the poorest 70%, I guess, in their empirical design, the influence that they have, or basically don't have. Right. So I think, so it's not just about norms versus procedure. I think it's about what are the norms that the people in power have, and then that vision gets realized because they determine both the procedure and the policies, right? I create the rules, and then with the rules, the policies that I want get realized. And I think it's a Weberian definition of power that, you know, basically person A can get person B to do something even against his or her will.
Right, right. I like this
That
definition. Yeah.
yeah, that's the definition of power. And I'm uh and so that's why I think in any kind of, you know, legal analysis this would have to be added. Okay, so one more thing I want to say about Habermas, um which is so if my understanding of this public sphere argument is that, I mean, that Habermas seems to be an idealist. I mean,
He is.
I haven't read his work very closely, but it seems to me that he, you know, has this idea of like people able to, you know, reason things out in a kind of public forum. And so, you know, he has this idea of like we all attend or participate in a public forum. We voice our opinion, and if there's a contradiction because there's different opinions, then, you know, we eventually reason it out, and then there will be a vote on it at the end, and then you know, and then everybody gets something. That's sort of idea, and 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 the way how he depicts it, it's definitely idealistic. In the same way that, you know, I don't know, a communist is an idealist, right? It's like, why can't we abolish private property? We put all of the resources together, and you know, there will magically not be any conflicts between you know, various actors within the community. And right, that, of course, you know, the idea, the opposite camp is the realist camp, and yeah, the realists perhaps don't think that that you can organize a public sphere really effectively. I was listening to the talk that Slavoj Žižek gave. He's a Slovenian intellectual.
I'm happy you mentioned him.
Yeah, but I mean, no,
Yeah.
Žižek makes a very good point against democracy. Interesting.
Yeah.
Which is, I mean, and by democracy, I mean, he doesn't mean, you know, the elected representative. I mean, so he's talking about a direct democracy, direct participation.
Right.
You know, kind of like you know, like the socialists favored worker-owned co-ops idea, right? Which is that the workers themselves would own the company rather than the, you know, CEOs and whatever, you know, the managers. And and Slavoj Žižek, I mean, he dissed that idea, not just because, you know, well, you know, the CEO class doesn't want you to be in power, but rather that he himself doesn't bother with, you know, how should I say, taking responsibility. That is to say, you know, yeah, like he's very open. He's like, I'm an intellectual. I want to watch, you know, documentaries, and I want to write books. You know, that's what I want to do. I don't want to, you know, argue over, you know, production and, you know, output quotas and targets and, you know, profit loss statements and, you know, investment decisions, and, you know, future direction of the company and all these other things. And I actually emotionally agree with this sentiment, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, so I guess, so I guess I was raising the point about Zizek just to say, you know, if you want to be a realist, then this, you know, idealized public sphere might not be applicable. Now then the idealists will say, no, we have to do our best to get as close as possible to, you know, creating the public sphere where everybody's equal, presumably.
Yeah, I think I really like the point that you mentioned, Zizek, because like apparently like he's like the most famous like critique about Habermas, and also like the cohorts of this like Frankfurt Schule in 1960s. And I do think, to be honest, that like in my own characterization, that the most important question here lies in the distinction between the beginning of the end, or the end of the beginning. By saying that, I'm trying to posit, I'm trying to locate Jürgen Habermas' argument in the stream of thought that spans over centuries, especially in this like so-called like German political philosophy and German social theories. For me, like the question is Habermas' this argument about, for example, like as you have just mentioned, like public sphere, or his later arguments about like discursive like rationality, like is that a part? Is that the end of this long history of this German idealism, in which this emphasis about, for example, like differences between prestige and norms and something like that evolves? Or like Habermas belong to a new tradition, or say the beginning, the end, like it's like the start of everything. It's like from Habermas, you have a new generation, or a new train of thoughts that a lot of like very recent topics will be evolved. For me, like my take is, I think Habermas belongs to the old tradition. So are folks of Frankfurt Schule. I know this what I'm saying, like if I put so bluntly, might offend a lot of people, but I do think Habermas doesn't really realize that this so-called pre-given distinction between this idealists and like realists cannot be resolved by this very pragmatic ways of like reconciliation, which is actually what he's doing. You're right by saying that he's idealist. Habermas is idealist. But if you look at his very political writings, talking about like the future of European Union, the future of the United Nations, his solution is actually very pragmatic. It's not something like, and actually that's the common issue of almost each and every thinkers from the tradition of idealism. When you are trying to confront these real world issues, sooner or later you will be fallen. You will fall into the camp of like not the realists, but pragmatists. You have to like maneuver and trying to like improvise. Eventually, have to come up. Okay, so like that's the solution.
So could we discuss briefly what his ideas are about the European Union and what he's trying to accomplish with?
Right, like for example, like one of his most interesting arguments about like. Trust me, like I don't even want to start this. Okay, so of course, like from this early like after Iraq War, the so-called like global order is somehow like jeopardized by this one-sided unilateral move of the US to initiate an invasion. So at that time, like in European intellectual circles, there were discussions about it, and Habermas, as he always does, like came up with this idea that the solution was a way out of this like dilemma, because he basically characterized the situation in post 9/11 world as a dilemma. You have the global like order needs so-called mechanism to function, in which US is positioned as a leader. So it seems like it's a paradox. We can't really have a global order without a leader, but like with a leader, it's very easy to escalate into hegemony. So his solution is basically to reform United Nations. I know it sounds a little bit like weird. Okay, and he pushes forward. He said like, if I'm going to like reform United Nations, the first thing I'm going to do is now to change the structures of like Security Council, in which like 5 countries have this deciding votes, and other countries have this like a rotating role as a chair. So Habermas' like proposal is to give power to the General Assembly, which is assembly of almost all members of United Nations. and use that as a kind of counterforce against security like council. So in his picture, there are basically two powers. One is of the Security Council, which is dominated by big powers, US, these 5 countries, and maybe some other like G7 countries. And at the same time, we have another so-called General Assembly, where we have like this, I don't know, like cohorts of countries. Most of them are small countries. And in his articulation, this way will go beyond this current scenario. Big countries have their way to say, small countries have their vote. And it's somehow like this, I don't know, this like US like Congress design. I don't know if he can get this idea from this.
It's like the Senate almost, right? Where
Right.
if you like
Right.
Vermont has the same number of Senate seats as California, which have very different populations, right?
But basically, if you see his logic, like to be honest, I don't think it makes any sense. I think that's the most funniest like proposal I've ever heard about like reform of so-called global order. Because like at first we know how little the role that United Nations has played in global politics, right? International politics. Second is, I don't really see a point that by giving the more like gravity, by giving more voting powers to so-called like smaller countries, there could be like counterbalance to so-called like the global hegemony. That's basically, oh my God, like basically you ignore the existence of like private capital, which is very prevalent in the current like global order. You ignore multinational enterprises, Google, Amazon, they play a more important role, I think, like with all respect than Czechoslovakia, I'm sorry, Czech Republic, where countries, I think like the GDP of the smaller countries in Europe is not even as much as the yearly profit of the so-called American corporate giants. And in a world order that is scheduled, so that is laid out as such, how can you expect a reform through some configuration of United Nations? I think itself is very problematic. And beyond that, the point lies in his characterization and also his so-called articulation of his like solution. It's like, as you correctly put it out, it is almost like the same idea of like US Congress, which we all know it is a very pragmatic compromise at that time. It's not out of this like very genius design by any of these founding fathers, right? Like it's more about this necessary compromise to reach out to certain consensus, so to speak, at the time of like Philadelphia Convention. Otherwise, you can't really have a constitution out, right? So I mean, I'm maybe speaking too much about Habermas, but I mean, that's why I'm saying like he's a part of this old generation. He's a part of this European idealists who was cultivated in this intellectual tradition of
German
19th century.
idealists. It's very specific.
Yeah. Right. So like I mean,
the English and the French will have a different opinion about this.
Yeah. Like especially like in Germany, where you have this strong like Nationalkultur thing, you know, like which preconditions their thoughts. So, and that is why, to be honest, as I correctly put it, like the dimensions of power, especially the power of like agenda citing folks, the power of like decision making folks, is somehow like dislocated in this train of thoughts. And that's where I think Michel Foucault and this whole French tradition kind of intervene, kind of like strikes Habermas, because like that's something I don't think like in his like conceptual network can be easily started out. Where are biopolitics? Where are all this like interesting examples that Michel Foucault has written, right? Like I don't think Jürgen is ready to answer any of these questions. Although, I mean, it is somehow like very interesting because you also talk about this U.S. Supreme Court. This is like actually, like, I think among legal scholars, this is like old debate. But like, if you have this sociological lens, right, nowadays, at least like for me, I kind of get something different from this old debate. You know, like in whole this train of thoughts in this like U.S. constitutional law, basically the cornerstone of U.S. judicial review, which gives the power to U.S. Supreme Court, starts from the case of Marbury versus Madison, the case in which
about judicial review.
Exactly, it's kind of declared this so-called supreme law, as you put it, in this whole like legal order of this country, and after that, like for 200 years, that is the first case every students of law school have to study almost at the first like year. And also, like the first thing that each and every U.S. like constitutional law professor have to deal with, and so you have this whole like, I mean, body of scholarship talking about things like that. But if you see that from a very current perspective, or say like if you combine what's happening in the recent right to choose cases, it seems to me that this so-called like supremacy of like federal law is also, as what I have talked about Jürgen Habermas, is a part of this old tradition. Although like Jürgen Habermas belongs to this tradition of this German idealism, for me, this like the supreme law of the country, was it the law of the land, that derives from another like so-called old tradition that's from like English common law. You know, like in English legal history, common law was used as a way of integrating the country. Henry II, no, Henry II, I think, right? He used this common law. He used the course of the so-called like the course of the king to travel like across whole England to unify different like legal practices, to make sure that like there is certain kind of legal certainty, so to speak, for all people like in England to deal with their own businesses. So this is a tradition that starts from late 14th, 15th centuries and kind of evolves along the way. And in this tradition, we have this idea of a court, like in US, called like the Supreme Court, that gives the final verdicts of the things, of the disputes. And the verdict itself becomes the source of the law. That is also like, I think for me, like at this, like we move to this part, this very controversial verdict of the U.S. Supreme Court kind of demonstrates how this so-called supreme law of the land is sometimes at odds with a world of social media, a world of
public opinion, even, right? I mean, I think it's like
exactly,
two-thirds majority that's in favor of abortion now.
And like it just like seems so odd. It just seems so odd. If you don't, it's not about like legal scholars' opinion. It's about like you see it as a layman, outside this like law school training. You just think it's so odd. Okay, there are 9 people who make a decision about something, and you got millions of people who are obliged to follow this decision. Like it's not only about like majority rule, anti-majority rule. I think the fact itself is kind of like paradoxical, and that is, I think, like the point of this argument, at the point of this controversy for now.
Well, I think, you know, if you want to talk about the origin of that, let's say, abortion ruling, or also a ruling about gun laws, and you know, the ruling about you know, restricting the Environmental Protection Agency from regulating the emissions of factories, and other similar, and also there was a ruling about public school prayers,
Mm-hmm.
which was now permitted. I mean, of course, uh, as sort of as a liberal, you could sort of choose. Well, okay, am I going to target the Supreme Court justices for making these choices?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I would actually go back in history a little bit
Mm-hmm.
to say that there were two judge appointments that the Republican Senate majority and the Mitch McConnell
Mm-hmm.
blocked, and I think those are the two crucial pieces here, right? So
Right.
when Justice Antonin Scalia passed away,
Mm-hmm.
there was an 11-month period between his death and the end
Right.
of Obama's term as president.
Mm-hmm.
The failed appointment of Merrick Garland,
Right.
and then the appointment of Neil Gorsuch as a result
Mm-hmm.
of that missed appointment. And then the second event was the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
Which is quite sudden to everyone.
Yeah,
Quite sudden to everyone. Yeah.
three
Nobody really
months.
anticipated that, right? Like you still remember that? Like that was really a big shock. The moment when
Yeah,
I have this like news alert like on my phone, I was like, what?
and
WTF.
and then Ginsburg, in her deathbed, said, please Trump, do not appoint a new justice until you won the election. Basically, that would be the
Right,
assumption,
right,
right?
right, right, right.
And they did it anyway. I mean, they made an appointment within 2 months, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and now, okay, so I'm actually I don't have a problem with the Coney Barrett appointment.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Making it very quickly. But then if you say, well, that's not a problem, then certainly the blocking Merrick Garland, that was a problem. Um,
Mm-hmm.
uh, Now, then, if you said, well, okay, the Coney Barrett appointment um, was a problem, uh, then you could say then the Merrick Garland blocking was not a problem. So I mean, it's one
Right.
of those two, but I think it's those two that sort of come together, where essentially the Republican Senate majority opinion is,
Right.
you know, we use the procedures to get normatively done what we want to get done, right? Um, and now, see, the question is, so if you really like a old school constitutional lawyer, legal scholar, where you think, well, we want to preserve the I don't know, the legal traditions of the past, then you don't want the Democratic Senate majority to be doing the same things that the Republican has done in the past. And so that's where we get into um, a little bit of this dilemma where, I mean, essentially procedure gets abused to the point that yeah, that it undermines the original principles of justice and decency.
I think that's another point. I guess I'm speaking this line too many times today, but I think I absolutely like agree because I think like this what you said this the tragic history the recent history of like so-called like Supreme Court justice appointment is not a very heartening one. And by saying that, I think it almost highlights the interesting relationship in between power, the one we just talked about, and so-called like the making of the judiciary. And in this sense, I have to specify the power I just mentioned is not this, I don't know, like Enlightenment era Hobbes perception of power, like in Leviton, like in early like Enlightenment writings. I'm talking about this very Foucauldian, very like postmodern conception of power. And if you accept this whole framework of power that emerged after the Second World War, you will see how much politicized this like appointment hearing at Senate level has moved along. It is like if you do this historical like comparison, you think it's totally unbelievable. Let me give you like this very like it's very well known. I'm pretty sure you know it, but like if you see it like at this like current circumstances, you will find it's very amazing. One of the most liberal period of time in the history of U.S. Supreme Courts happened after the end of Second World War until the end of like Great Society experiment of LBJ. And
Warren was Chief Justice, right?
Yeah, like Warren Court makes I think the 75% of this whole period of time. And I think nowadays it is almost impossible to nominate the Supreme Court justice like Earl Warren. You know what? Because he was a politician. Earl Warren was, I think he was a governor of California or someplace. I kind of forget, but he was like a career politician. He had his political opinions, he had his political agenda, and his own career, he sort of like delivered it like when he was in office. And if you look at this very recent like Supreme Court justice like appointment hearings in the US, you can find out it is almost impossible to nominate someone who was a career politician, like push them onto the bench. It is almost impossible. Do you know why? I think it's kind of easy to understand. It's like if you had your opinion, it will be very difficult for you to survive through this process. Just think about what kind of question you will get on these kind of hearings, right? Like you will get senators questioning your, I don't know, whatever policies. And then it will become a totally show of partisanship. And then it will, you know what the answer, it will be like everyone knows the stake. So nowadays, I think that the pivot point, according to this Harvard legal historian, Martin Horowitz, happens like in Reagan era, when there was this like very conservative Supreme Court justices who was a conservative legal scholar was nominated to the court, and it was eventually like blocked by this Senate, which was dominated by Democratic force. And that was a very bad start because at that time, like the whole procedures, it was the first time in history that this hearing become this very political show. Everyone's questioning this conservative scholars' previous writing. Like, for example, they asked him like what do you mean you write about, like, for example, substantive due process, which is a very in Lochner era of Supreme Court history, but it was a common instrument for the court to strike down the protection of the labor. And at that time, like in this hearing, you get like very democratic, very progressive, like senators questioning him about that. So that was a very bad example. Like after that, like each and every hearing become very much politicized. And although like it's not like I'm not criticizing this, like by talking about this, I'm simply trying to emphasize this almost like inevitable process in which politicization is a part of our life. It is a part of like judicial process. It's a part of economic process. It's a part of like even cultural politics, so to speak, if there is something like that. So, all right, so like this is the interesting thing. So like after like 1980s, it is almost impossible to nominate like a Supreme Court justice who's not like a career judge, and it is impossible to nominate a Supreme Court justice who have said something that is so-called like stupid inside the legal circle, that is to be very like explicit in his or hers like legal opinions, and that could be in my mind very it's a very important feature, and everyone must confront it, including I mean like the general public in the US.
Right. So structurally, I think it's very difficult to take the politics out of the
Away.
judicial
Right.
system,
It's impossible to take it away.
because it goes back to this, Marbury versus Madison case, right? Which is, once you establish that the judges have the political power
Right.
to make the judgment over congressional laws and
Mm-hmm.
presidential decrees,
Mm-hmm.
then then the judges are political. Then, of course, the people that are appointing
Mm-hmm.
the judges in the political process want to make sure that these judges are ideologically in alignment
Right.
with the view of the appointers.
Right.
And I don't know, but the judicial nomination process that the American system has is not practiced in in all the countries, right? I mean, I think like there are
Yeah.
I don't know, in the European countries, I don't know how many, but
Well,
you know
it's very difficult to
it
compare this American system with like
yeah.
this continental tradition, but at least we can compare that with its counterparts. For example, like in UK, we say like
Right.
in
I mean,
Australia, right?
shouldn't
Yeah.
judges be appointed by their peers, essentially, by other judges?
That's actually the idea. That's the idea of this like common law tradition. Like it is always a matter of peers. It's always a matter of like the community. So that should be the way. And that kind of brings us back to the regions of this American way, right? Like how does it come about? When and where does it start? And somehow like you figured out that it's a part of this very inconvenient compromise, uh, like in this post Civil War politics. Like the hearing as such doesn't really become a thing until I think there are a couple of different like historical accounts about this history, and they track it to different period of time, but I mean, nevertheless, if you look at this whole like accounts of this history of this proceedings, you can always track back to the early 20th century and the consequence of post-war compromise. It's like, okay, so there was a civil war, and it ends like in this very catastrophic way, and the Reconstruction 1.0 doesn't really occur the way it was conceived to be. And what happened in the end is like by the end of 20th century, you have this very interesting social fabric. And the only way to keep this republic going is to craft this kind of compromise, making sure different like forces, different like divisions of this country can somehow like stay as a cohort instead of like breaking up. And that turns out to be a very I mean, not that like satisfying, although like history is never satisfying. You can not say like there's a perfect solution for anything, like because it's always about contingencies, it's always about contradictions. So although like if you look at it, you will see, okay, that's why they have gone this far. We have to, I mean, but like okay, speaking of the current, we can't really go back in time and change the direction of history, or say like that is something that is totally wrong. That's not the way we're supposed to deal with things like that, right? So like it's more about to craft a new contingency, to create new opportunities in history, and to make it as a possibility to reinvent this dynamic that makes the so-called like politicized process and create this kind of like counter process that goes against this currently highly politicized confirmation hearings. I don't know what that will be. I mean, but basically when it happens, there will be a way. And if you look at this current like protest movements in the US, I see this reactions from from the political sphere, but also in business, like in businesses, you see a lot of like interesting moves from big corps, like some of them offering, for example, like paid leaves for their like employees to do this like abortion in states that allow this kind of procedures. You see some reaction from big corps that try to create this like counterbalance to this very
Yeah, I mean, but it's not a societal counterbalance, because the problem is that okay, Google pays me to get an abortion in another state, but most people don't work for Google, I mean, or for any of these
That's true.
big companies. So
But then like you have to conjure this with your previous like take about this people without power, right? Like it's like it's not I'm arguing that people without power should be kept in this way, but I mean, if we talk about how it is forged, maybe I mean, the roles of these major actors need to be taken seriously. I don't know, maybe, but I kind of get your point. You're right. It's like, yeah, it's again a very partial solution, and it's not a very, as you put it, it's not a matter of like societal like reaction, right? Yeah.
Yeah, but again, I think there's eventually going to be societal pushback, and we'll see more of that hopefully. I wanted to go back to your earlier point. Again, have to go back to Habermas with this one world government sort of idealism, and
I like the way you raise your eyeball.
So
you raise your eyeball.
So ideally, I very much like the idea of world governments. I mean, I had a chat with a friend recently about activists and scholars who advocate for open borders. So those are immigration scholars who document the injustices that come with placing barriers between countries, physical boundaries. And I mean, I just saw this case recently in a Tunisian woman that was flying to the United States via a German airport, I think in Frankfurt or something. And Lufthansa has been on strike, so they canceled a bunch of flights. And she had to catch the plane the next day, and the people, the passengers with the American and European passports would be able to exit the airport and book a hotel, but the Tunisian woman wasn't able to do that, and she had to basically stay overnight in the airport lounge, I guess. Right. So this is just a simple example, but I'm sure like there's probably like hundreds of thousands, millions of examples. Like all the refugees that had entered the EU from Syria, Pakistan, Afghanistan, all these places. The Central American, the Triangle country migrants to the United States, the Mexican border. So there are these tensions that exist with closed borders, and of course, if you had the one world government, that would sort of fall away. Now, the other issue, however, is that every decision that you have to make as a policymaker is always about trade-offs, right? It's not right. It's not about simple solutions. there are already issues about domestic political legitimacy, specifically for lower skilled workers, right? The
Right,
lower skilled
right.
workers of the global north that will face the competition of global south residents that are entering the country in the labor markets. And then the nationalist backlash that we are seeing already today, I think, are going to further intensify as the pressure to international migration is going to increase, mainly because of climate change. But then there's associated problems like, the drug trade in Central America. You have the wars in Sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East. So there's just structural reasons that will promote an increase in international migration. And then if you look at the number of border fences and walls, they have been on the increase. I believe when the Berlin Wall fell, I think there were 15 border fences in the world, and I think today it's like over 70, and it keeps growing. So I guess it's just one of the world dilemmas we are creating, right?
Right.
Where so we want to grow the economy further and further, so we're going to have to emit more CO2, and then there's going to be more global warming. Then we destroy the habitat of the people in the global south, and then they sort of move to the north. But then we don't want them to come, so then we build up the fences. Right, so I think the migration issue shows that, look, this is something that for which there must be some kind of global consensus. There must be some global procedure to be able to deal with the increase in human movement. Right. So, but I'm not expecting you as a legal scholar to offer
No.
proper
Actually,
responses to all of that.
I'm quite interested, like, in this topic. Actually, like, I'm also thinking about like writing something in this like realm. Look, like, from my canon, we played a very somehow like I don't know, a little bit like, I won't say tricky, but we play this very opportunistic. I guess all lawyers are kind of opportunistic. This role in this, like, in topics like this. For example, like, ideally, I think, like, I'm of this like post idealism generation. So of course, like I choose not to talk too much about ideals, and especially like thinking as a lawyer, I have to sometimes be very like pay some attention about some temporary solutions rather than long term, say like eventual solutions to things, or say to questions like this, especially like you mentioned the case of this refugees. And like when it comes to lawyers, usually our work is to offer them a fix, even if it's not that like sound, if it's not like idealistically like perfect, so to speak. So what I have observed in this process is that the possibility of building something not based on global consensus, but based on global contradiction, based on disagreement, has been a little bit matured. But saying that, I'm talking about the current mechanism between these countries, between these like borders that is still like at play nowadays. If you look at what's going on like in this Mexican border, you know like regardless of Trump administration's executive orders, actually some local governments, together with their counterparts in Mexican parts of the world, they have somehow configured like array of solutions. It's temporary, it's not perfect, but somehow keeping the folks in a relatively safer way. And I think for lawyers, like what we are trying to do in general is trying to push forward things like this, making sure that there is some ground, some legitimacy in this, and we can find some legal support for this. So in the end, like we can somehow push it to a better like level, to a level that is more humane, more more adjustable to folks in these very terrible scenarios. But you know, like it's sometimes because I also got the sociology training, so I feels like myself in this like internal conflict, right? So like as a lawyer, I have to offer some argument because like there are conflicts in front of you. You have to come up with an answer, even if it doesn't work. But as a sociologist, it's not your job to come up with like an alternative, right? It's about how to figure out what's going on right now. And I mean, the latter kind of like make it more complicated for me. And you're exactly right by saying that this current situation, especially under the background of this global tensions between countries, the situation of like refugees, of international immigration has become more and more complicated. And it doesn't really seem to go away, even when Trump has gone, a new administration has taken over. It seems this kind of dynamic still there. By the way, like perhaps we don't really have time for this right now, but maybe we can do it in another day, talking about this raising tension between China and the US, and also like this cross-strait issues. You know, all of these things they don't help. They don't help, especially like when we are trying to craft some solutions about refugees. I mean, for lawyers on the ground, it's actually this quite simple situation. If these two countries are in good terms, the immigration officer from one country make a call, and their counterparts in another country will easily pick it up. But if you look at what's going on between China and America and the US, I don't think either side will easily pick up that call. The same thing happens like in other countries. So I think what's at stake right now is we have to operate in a lack of consensus. And that means like each and every side is at this scenario of like prisoner's dilemma. Like we don't know what the next step of the other side will be. So we have to speculate. That's kind of the situation we are in right now. And I don't know, like that's a very tricky thing, to be honest. That's a very tricky thing. And
Right.
and yeah.
We're essentially hoping that things don't blow up in international relations, but unfortunately they have already. So when I visited Vienna, and
Yeah.
one of my cousin's friends is an Austrian guy,
Mm-hmm.
a music teacher,
Mm-hmm.
but he actually lives in Taiwan. So he's a music
Oh
teacher
yeah.
in Taiwan, and he only visits his family in Austria, like in the summer. And so I asked him, what do you think about these cross-strait tensions? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
whatever Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, or whether she might not do it. I mean, essentially, if you think of like a tinder box, and you just have to light the fire and the whole thing explodes, right? That's a sort of situation. That's how I understand the situation. But then I asked him, okay, well, do you think there will be war? And he said, no, there's not. And
Yeah, yeah,
this is quite interesting. I mean, he says, well, if I thought that the mainland was going to invade, then I never would want to live in Taiwan. But of course, he lives there, so he's like, yeah. He judges it to be okay because because the tensions obviously had been ongoing
yeah.
since the partition of the country in '49, and then there was another flare up when the DPP first won the election, Chen Shui-bian, in the early 2000s. And then there were also good periods, in the Ma Ying-jeou shook hands with
Right.
Xi Jinping in Singapore in 2015. So there were ups and downs, and so I think that's how he judges the situation. But then I don't know. I mean, I saw an interview in the documentary with Ukrainians
Right.
emerging from the rubbles of the bombed cities, and and one of them was asked, "Do you think that the Russians would dare to invade?" They said, "No." I mean, even until early February, we were like, "No." I thought it was bluffing. I mean,
Right.
yeah, I thought this was a tension that we would always kind of have,
Right.
but I didn't think that there was going to be a full scale war. So yeah, that is to say,
I like your facial expression right now. You
yeah,
should. You should.
yeah. So people who are absolutely 100% confident
Yeah.
that the cross-strait war is not going to happen, I think at the very latest with the Ukraine war, um, you know, um, should be a little bit more careful about their source of optimism, I should say. Uh, and that, so the Communist Party China, they officially say, okay, 2049, which is the 100-year jubilee of of the
Ah,
People's
right.
Republic.
Right. Right.
That
Right.
is,
Right. Right.
well, they say it is the very latest point at which the reunification was going to happen. Now,
Okay.
this suggests that it could be an earlier point, and I don't know. I mean, so Xi Jinping is 69 years old now, and he wants the reappointment in the fall. Um, and I do think that he wants to deliver within his lifetime.
He
Uh,
wants to what? I'm sorry.
he wants to deliver on the unification,
Ah.
unification
Okay. Yeah.
within his lifetime.
Yeah.
Because so his aspiration was, I'm going to be one of the great leaders. So Mao Zedong was a great leader because he was the founder. Deng Xiaoping
Yeah.
was a great leader because he brought economic prosperity in Hong Kong.
Yeah.
Um, and well, if Xi Jinping is number 3 in that list, um, well, what is on his plate? I mean, if he says, okay, well, is it really Belt Road Initiative? I mean, well, it's kind of extending
Right.
the
I think it's
the
falling apart right now,
yes,
right? That initiative. Yeah, to my
the,
best knowledge. It's now that like in the past 2 years, it doesn't really operate that well. Yeah.
they don't invest as much, right?
Right,
Because
right. And
they
also there were a lot of like problems, liquidity problems, bankruptcies. It seems that the credit that the central government tries to offer is not that much. And like this international deals that basically the death sentence. So yeah, but you're right. You're right. I guess your point is like, yeah, and like if Belt and Road doesn't really work, that doesn't really work. it seems that you got to try something different, right?
Yeah, it's just a unification. And now you see, so I mean, so I grew up as a Westerner post Cold
Mhm.
War, right? So this is a very important. It's a very important geographic and geopolitical moment, you could
Right.
say, which makes me totally shocked about the Russian or the Chinese way of
Of
thinking
course.
with respect
Mhm.
to geopolitics and the fact that, I mean, like, Clausewitz's dictum that war is politics by other means. Well, I mean, in one sense, I mean, the Clausewitz dictum has always been true, right? As long as states had existed. I mean, it's for hundreds, thousands of years,
Right.
right?
Right.
But I was sort of born and raised in a geopolitical moment in which,
Hmm.
like the Fukuyama thesis, right? The liberal democracy
Right.
prevailing.
Right.
We sort of
Right. Right. Right.
pushed aside this
Yeah.
Clausewitzian, Hobbesian, anarchistic, global power struggle,
Hmm.
um, and unfortunately, I think now gradually, at least in my generation,
Right.
is now being socialized into um, the Clausewitzian kind of thinking, because of the geostrategic calculations that happen in Moscow and in Beijing, um, where they're saying, well, we have a right as powerful states to shift and redirect the boundaries
Right.
of states.
Hmm.
Um, and I don't know. I saw this interview with Lee Hsien Loong, the Singapore Prime Minister,
Hmm.
um, who's very much opposed to the Russian invasion, um, because he says that so he doesn't believe in the Western narrative of
Right.
promotion and defense of freedom and democracy and rule of law.
Hmm. Hmm.
His way of thinking is about this principle of national sovereignty,
Hmm.
that the if a big power can determine the shift in the national boundaries, and therefore the appropriation of territory from small states, then small states like his, Singapore, are going to be scared
Right.
for
Right.
the right reasons.
For good reason. For good reason. Yeah.
So it's really about, I mean, even if you say, well, okay, Ukraine is like, many thousands of kilometers away from, Southeast Asia.
Hmm.
But, you know, I mean, like if you read the history of Singapore, I mean, like they were part of Malaysia, they were part of British
Right. Right.
Empire. I mean,
And actually,
uh,
I think you have written something about it, right? About the Chinese disappeared these countries, right? Like it's one of your books.
yeah, that's right. I wrote about the
Right.
Hakka
Right.
people, and because Li Guangyao,
He's a Hakka,
he's
right?
Hakka,
He's
yeah, that's
Hakka,
right, yeah,
right?
from Dabu in
Hmm.
Guangdong, and yeah, so right, I mean, so because they used to be part of these other empires,
Hmm.
where actually they wanted to stay there, they wanted to feel safe, like even when the British departed officially as
Right.
colonial power,
Hmm.
they kept the naval base in Singapore for maybe another 10 years or so.
Right. 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 Right.
And actually and Lee Kuan Yew was pleading with the Brits
Hmm.
to keep the port open, and eventually they
Hmm.
converted it um, to a civilian port, which became a huge port. But anyway, um, but yeah, because Lee Kuan Yew was thinking, um, the Brits are the lesser of evils, I guess, because in Indonesia and Malaysia were sort of the big neighbors that could decide to
Right.
take over in Singapore. Yeah, so I think that principle of international relations, I think, of what do the strong and the weak states are allowed to do, I think it's really quite important point. And Lee Hsien Loong says that in the real Hobbesian world, where the strong states prey upon the weak, it is not only the small states that suffer, but the big states too.
Right.
Because the big states will, well, they have huge military expenses because they have to keep out the other big powers. And in that way, of course, they are implicitly lowering the standard of living of their own people. And that is effectively what is happening. I mean, the United States, with the biggest military spending in the world, will continue to boost military spending. And I think that, the Ukraine war, having to sell more weapons to Taiwan, and other regions in the world, they are equipping. And then, China, they recently, I think they built the third aircraft carrier recently. And and then the Russians, of course, have a big defense industrial complex, and of course they're going to be wanting to spend more to fight more wars. So really, I mean, the Hobbesian world is actually, well, in Lee Hsien Loong's narrative, it is bad for everybody, essentially.
I like your like characterization of what's going on, and actually I think like you can't really find too many people as same as me who kind of share this perspective, which, as you put it, like as a Westerner, also like a minority, who kind of like grew up in this optimism and the celebration of the end of history. So I think like our like life experiences very much. Oh my God, that's actually your first question, but I haven't really got the chance of like laying it out. I mean, like our life experiences are somehow like similar, although like also a little bit like nuanced. So like we are both like this minorities in society that subscribe to a different like ideology as opposed to Russia and China. So of course it was for me also a big shock when the war like broke out. And I'm still right now in Berlin, a city that is only like hundreds kilometers away from like Poland, like Germany border, which means I got the chance of witnessing the inflow of Ukraine refugees like on a daily basis. And actually, like in the first days, I think in the first months of the war, actually, I was one of these volunteers who helped these people. So seeing that, the great shock that occurred to me was beyond description. It is like a kind of life, a kind of state of mind that's never like grasped me before. That said, I mean, I think I grew up in this like intellectual tradition that is, I think, a little bit more left leaning, although not to the direction to the degree of so-called like Chinese Communist Party, but like I did like grow up with some post Cold War like left wing writing, where world systems. So I think, like, for me, this perspective of international political economy sometimes outweigh the approach of international relations. Because for me, I mean, after Second World War, maybe much more earlier than that, the whole world is built. The order of the world is built upon the basic rules of capitalism. And even if Russia and China were and still are governed by so-called authoritarian governments, and in China it is called a communist government, but in my own formulation, it is also a part of this whole global production network. If you see it like in the context of like 1950s, 1960s, China was actually like also part of this like global system in which like Chinese enterprises, although at the time state-owned, also contribute a lot to the production, to the consumption of raw material, to the production of basic like industrial goods, and the flow of this kind of things has never stopped. So if you see it from this way, I think like the emotional shock, I think, is there. I had it, I still have it, and I think I'm going to have it like in years to come. But at the same time, if you see it from the structural perspective, this global it's not only like expropriation, it's also like extraction is always there. And the clash between Russia and Ukraine is somehow like an extension, like on that whole map. And so like I kind of agree with your Austrian friend when he was saying that there's a little chance of like this like all-out war between Taiwan and China. Although like I kind of get your point that this kind of optimism is not fully grounded. It's a little bit speculative. And if you like conjure that with your personal or subjective feelings, it can be much worse than you expected. But I simply want to emphasize that the existence of like Singapore and also Hong Kong, where I had like worked for a period of time as a lawyer, is a consequence of this global capitalism. The integrity of these cities derives from global trade and global finance. Otherwise, there's no way that the recognition of the city-states is widely accepted in these Western countries, right? Like you wrote books about like Akai, so like I'm pretty sure you have paid some attention to the very interesting like link between British governments and Singapore governments, like at the founding era, and also the driving force behind that. And the same logic also applied to Hong Kong, although the history is a little bit more complicated. And also like we have talked about refugees. Hong Kong refugees is a more complicated issue. Maybe we can talk about sometime later. But seeing from this lens, it seems we have been in a new stage of global capitalism. Hong Kong and Taiwan, together with like Singapore, the fate of this kind of like city-state or semi-autonomous so-called like region in Asia countries might enjoy a very different treatment comparing with that of Ukraine. It's partly because the gravity of these city-states or of these like regions in global capitalism.
Right, the semiconductors, chips that produce
right,
Taiwan are an important part of the global value chain, right?
Right. And sadly, I don't think the West has given like enough attention to Ukraine in terms of this like industrial capacity. And by the way, if I'm the leader of like Ukraine, like Zelensky, I'm pretty sure he's now pretty occupied with fighting a war. But like if I'm going to have like this long-term plan, I'm going to emphasize on how to rebuild this manufacturing force in my country. For me, it is one of the things that Ukraine has sadly like ignored in this past decade, especially after 2008 when in that election. So the basic like the development of this whole country has turned to a like alternative way. It's more like Baltic countries other than other like Eastern European manufacturing capitals. So by doing that, the gravity of Ukraine in this global capital, global like production networks has been a little bit like marginalized, and it can somehow like illustrates the response of U.S. governments, especially the one and Obama, like the Obama administration's response to Crimean War. So when the Russian invasion started at that time, there are quite a few missteps. It's partially, in my own opinion, a part of this so-called priority sightings inside this U.S. in the foreign policy community. It is like if you
Because of
see
the pivot to Asia, pivot to China narrative, where it's like we don't want to get mixed up with the European problems, essentially.
well, you can say that as like a scholar of international relations, but for a scholar of like international political economy, you could say the missteps basically comes from a miscalculation of global energy situation and the landscape of alternative energy that fails to deliver in the decade to come. So like I think at that time, Obama administration didn't really understand that the so-called like boost of like so-called alternative energy will not be as fast as they believe. And eventually Russia's role in global energy network will still be as important as it was like in late 2000s. So that is actually now one of the most important bargaining chips of Russia right now. Like you were in Vienna, like you know what's happening like here. And like I think one of the most striking news I've read like on television, I'm sorry, like on newspapers, is one by economic minister in Germany. He just said like we should like restrain our times in showering because there will be limited power supply, and we must practice like finish our shower like in 3 or 5 minutes. That's like the moment I saw
I can do that. That's no problem.
yeah, I can also do that. Yeah, but like the moment I saw that, it's like, oh my god, it's like some wartime thing has come again. Like that's something so striking to me because like as we have put it, is we're living in this like the end of history era, right? Like is the matter which we are dealing with should be the problem of abundance, the problem of capitalism, and now it seems to be the problem isn't like free capitalism or say finance capitalism. It turns out to be wartime capitalism, like Lenin did, like Vladimir Lenin did, like in 2000. I'm sorry, 1920s. I mean, okay. So my point is like, I still try to. I'm not at no position. I'm not no place to downplay the hazard of a possible cross strait like conflict. But I still believe that if you espouse that, like with this current global capitalism scenario, an all-out war against Taiwan is very unlikely. I still think. I think it's quite possible that Xi Jinping strike one of the few like islands, like in the strait, so that to scare the Taiwanese to vote for a party that is more pro-Beijing instead of pro-Washington. I think that's still his playbook. I think this all-out war, this chance is very low. I still think it's very low. But actually, it's worse. I mean, it's worse. It's worse than all-out war. Yeah.
Right. So I want to bring up the earlier point about the connection between war and capitalism, and I think
Mm-hmm.
among left wing and Marxist scholars, I mean, there's this really
Mm-hmm.
really long debate about this. So I
Yeah,
mean, you,
right.
you already mentioned Vladimir Lenin. You could
I do mention Zizek.
you could mention Rosa Luxemburg,
Right.
John Hobson, a and then Jean, was it Jacques Jaurès or something?
Yeah,
Some
right. Jack Chirac, yeah.
Yeah, who said capitalism and war belong together like the clouds and the rain. Um, and But then I don't know. I mean, there's the opposite framing from a guy named Albert Hirschman,
Yeah, of course.
and then he builds on Montesquieu, the
Mm-hmm.
guy who came up with the balance of power between institutions. Um, but Montague essentially argues that commerce, capitalism, trade reduces the chances of war because his idea is like okay, so in any community you have like the top 10%, you could say, in terms of ambition, ambitious, mostly men, I guess, to be really gendered here. Um, and these ambitious men, they either going to become generals in war
Mm-hmm.
or they become CEOs in businesses.
Right.
And the more that a country channels their ambitious men to in the positions of business and
Mm-hmm.
trade, the less likely the war is going to be. And so then there's the McDonald's thesis
Mm-hmm.
about of war,
Mm-hmm.
where essentially, if you have McDonald's, then you're not going to fight a war with another country that has a McDonald's.
Right, right, right.
And interestingly, of course, as soon as the Ukraine invasion happened, McDonald's pulled the business out of Russia,
Mm-hmm.
um, which I mean, it was not done out of altruistic reasons, but because the Western sanctions were cutting off the payment options for Russian businesses to its Western banks, I guess. But right, so and so I, so right, so there's two competing views here about capitalism and war, and
Mm-hmm.
I think I'm inclined now to agree with the latter view, with the
Mm-hmm.
Montesquieu view, that is to say
Mm-hmm.
that I agree with you that China's a bit inclination to wage the Taiwanese war
Mm-hmm.
is going to be tempered by the level of economic integration with the West, the
Mm-hmm.
dependence on the Western consumer markets, the dependence
Mm-hmm.
on Western technology, like
Mm-hmm.
yeah, specifically the Silicon Valley, the artificial intelligence, machine learning,
Right.
all these things where China has a lot of domestic capabilities now, but they still
Of course.
the flows
Mm-hmm.
from America.
Right, right.
And But now, I mean, if you remember a couple of days ago when Biden administration announced to open up semiconductor plants in the U.S., these were, I mean, according to the economic neoliberal globalized logic, this
Mm-hmm.
would have been a stupid decision, right? Because you always want to set up the factories in basically the cheapest labor but still rule of law country, right? Which I guess up until recently China was that country, right? But it's about this. So the Western idea is about this energy, technological, and economic independence
Mm-hmm.
from the East. I saw this article recently about so the offshore wind farms of Germany and the Netherlands
Mm-hmm.
in the North Sea, I guess.
Right,
Um,
right, right.
and then because the question is, okay, well, where do we source the components for those wind turbines? And the simple market answer would have been China, because China already
Yeah, yeah,
produces
yeah.
the
It seems that
the
way, right? It
wind
seems to be a very
turbines.
apparent answer.
Yeah, and the same thing with the solar panels, right? But now, interestingly, the Germans and the Dutch, they're saying, well, maybe because of these emerging geopolitical tensions, I mean, do we have to invest in our own wind turbine production?
Mhm.
And that would mess up the CO2 targets that the Western, the European countries have set for themselves, because, as you might know, the West has been able to, greenwash their own CO2 emissions
Mhm.
by externalizing the production to China, basically, and then they
Mhm.
import the parts back from China, and then and then the Chinese CO2 record is horrendous right now, right? I mean, it's going up
Yeah.
like crazy. And in India, it's heading in the same way. While the West says, look at us. I mean, we decreased the carbon emissions, but we still live a rich lifestyle because we're just importing the components back from China, right? Again, um, so okay, so now the problem is, if the West is going full scale to its what's called resilience in supply chains. And what they mean by resilience is insourcing, right? Basically, cut off
Mhm.
China and then bring the factories back to the West.
Mhm.
Um, of course, with much fewer jobs, because it's going to be very automated and things like that. But anyway, um, then you have a problem with the Taiwan situation, because so if you cut the economic relations West and China, then the Taiwan invasion will no longer be a trade-off, right?
Mhm.
You
Mhm.
you you won't be trading off economic relations with the West in order to gain Taiwan, because if you cut the economic relations, then it's like, yeah, of course we're going to
Mhm.
take Taiwan. I mean, what's going to stop us from doing it? Um, the same way, I mean, the Russian calculation was, well, the Russian calculation, I think, was they're going to impose sanctions on us, but in the same way as they did with Crimea,
Right,
which
right,
which
right,
is
right,
very minimal. I mean,
right.
they'll just do a little bit, and then we'll go in quickly, and then Ukraine will be part of the Russian Empire, and then we'll go back to selling gas to
Mhm.
to Germany and Austria and so forth, right? Um, and well, this time it didn't happen. So I think there was a jolt now. I think that uh, the West Europeans are waking up now. I mean, it was so complicated too. I mean, I saw the Spiegel cover of
Mhm.
the
Yeah, yeah.
the history of the gas relationship between Germany and Russia,
Right.
which really goes back to Willy Brandt.
Exactly.
I
Exactly.
mean,
That's basically the anchor of his like Ostpolitik. Yeah. That's basically is the anchor of his idea. Yeah. That's Willy Brandt is famous for his Ostpolitik and his whole like formulation of German post-war policies that follows. I mean, and well, you are. I think I I basically I think agree with what you are uh, describing, and also like I like the way you're juxtaposing like Hirschman with Lenin, and like the way that they encountered this topic. So I mean, I kind of try to like bring in another like dimension that you might find interesting, especially like I don't know if it's part of your like canon, but apparently it's part of mine. Uh, so like in the recent years, there were some debates about neoliberalism and also it's like convergence with social like conservatism. You get like Slobodian's book about globalists. You get like Melinda Cooper's book about family values, the latter of which I think is a very compelling one. She basically tried to figure out this new story in which so neoliberal state was the neoliberal reform is a little bit complemented by social conservative that highlights the role of family in societies. To put it simply, like when they are doing the Reagan, Thatcher, these folks are doing the so-called like supply side, like reform, and the folks who are taking the burden, the folks who are bearing the consequences, are American women, American families, who no longer have the support, financial support from welfare state, and who no longer have this like inclusion, like in fact, with this global Fordism. What they have instead is they're all on their own, although with more sponsorship from social conservatism, because they are so-called like model family. They're taking care of their own children and sponsoring or like supporting them to universities, which cost you half of your fortune. And this whole formulation, if they associate this like Melinda Cooper's characterization of like neoliberalism with what is going on like in this international political economy, you can see these very interesting parallels. So actually, like neoliberal economic logic isn't like a thing in itself. It has like it's like another part. I'm sorry. Right. It has is like parallel like logic that is like social conservatism, and so like actually that it is more like two sides of the same coin. And if you see that this way, you can have another perspective about what's going on like in China, and also its role in this cross-strait like relations. So you talk about trade-off. I agree. And like in this way, like Taiwan is like necessary trade-off, so to speak, in this like global production network. But at the same time, the way that Chinese are formulating this current foreign policy has a lot to do with this resurgence of social conservatism after like 1990s, after like Kahneman and everything. The centrality of family values in China, the billions of female like although in a different form, talking about the time for female to get married and the change of like a single child policy, all sort of things. They're like two sides of the same coin. And in this whole formula, Taiwan, the role of Taiwan is beyond this economic role. It also serves a role at the other, you know. It is because Taiwan is now playing a quite progressive role in global politics, in global production network. It is a country in East Asia that recognizes same-sex marriage. It is a country like in Asia that recognizes a lot of so-called progressive values, but mainland China has tried to deny. So Taiwan is like this very good the other if you are someone in Beijing trying to formulate your international policy. So instead of like taking it over through some military force, I think the calculation of Beijing is worse. It's darker. It's to make it as this is the other of China. It symbolized.
It's like they're misguided brothers and sisters, and we're going to bring them back into
Exactly.
the family.
It symbolizes everything bad of capitalism, right? It's about like same-sex marriage. It's about like things against family values. This is all sides of that. So I think like well, I don't know, like I don't know Xi Jinping himself, so maybe he will do some dumb choices. But if you assume that Beijing has been very smart along the way, so I guess for them the smartest play will be keeping Taiwan as this kind of puppet like state, giving it a lot of pressure, making sure the people who run this government is someone who is close to Beijing, but at the same time, making it as one of this bad example for people at mainland China. Look what you will be. Look how the country will be if there is no Communist Party. You'll become like so-called like liberal society like Taiwan, which is in their own right horrible. And if you see it that way, you can somehow understand like the similar logic that applies to Ukraine. And one of the few things I think like Ukrainian government has been, I got to be blunt here, absolutely wrong in the past decade. You know, like there was a very strong anti-liberal tendencies in Ukraine. There are quite a few political candidates who are basically deploying fascist rhetorics in Ukraine before the invasion. Although like after the invasion, we kind of like fall into the camp in which like, of course, we have to stand with Ukraine, but we cannot forget there are quite a few anti-liberal folks in that country who's basically playing that like fascist like rhetoric, as same as Putin is doing right now. So
yeah, but I think there's a difference between Ukrainian and Russian nationalism, because I mean, because Ukraine is, I mean, if you look at it from geopolitical perspective, I mean, they're a medium-sized country. I mean, they're not a superpower.
No, of course.
The Russian nationalism means we're going to extend the Ruski Mir, right, the Russian world,
yeah,
into basically Central and Eastern Europe. So I think that would include Poland, the Baltic states, Ukraine, Belarus, and Moldova, maybe, as far as possible. And Ukrainian nationalism usually means, like basically within borders. I mean, it's a little bit like Hungary. You know, in Hungary you have this Fidesz. You know, like
I think you're right in terms of international relations, but like what I try to emphasize is this consequence, like in social sphere, especially like in terms of like human rights, gender equality, and all sort of things.
Yeah, of course, that makes sense. But I would say there's still, I mean, from international relations, I mean, I think that's the most important argument, because you have to decide. Well, if you want to fight the Ukrainian nationalists, so to speak, then you should just support and cheer Putin. You know.
That would be horrible. That would be a horrible one. That'd be
right.
Horrible.
But then if you think that, you know, we have to fight the Russian nationalism, and I think the Russian nationalism is where the danger comes from, right? Because
of course,
it's imperialist.
Yeah, of course. This is if we talk about like this, like aggressive nationalism, actually, like Russia should be the first and the best example. And by talking about that, I simply try to emphasize that I do think Taiwan has done something very correct in the past few years, especially in terms of its social politics. Its engagement with a lot of like progressive like movements, talking about like gender equality, talking about family reform and other kind of things. It kind of like portrays itself as this leaders in this so-called like progressive values in East Asia, right? Like if you think of like the counterparts of Taiwan in this region, you got Singapore, who's still like a single party, and or at least like mostly single party democracy.
But can the economic structure of Ukraine and Taiwan be compared? I mean,
nah, not really.
Like Ukraine has like 1/3 of the GDP of Russia, even. I mean, per capita.
Right.
Much poorer. And Taiwan is kind of like a first world country. I mean, it's been like that for
it is years. And of course, like you can like subordinate this like social stuff to this like economic consideration, and thinking that as a part of this like first world thing, other than a single or like an individual layer of this like the reproduction of things. But I mean,
but don't you think that social liberalism is the product of economic abundance? Like those two things belong together, because because I don't see a lot of like liberal ideology in very poor countries, right?
That's a good take. But like first, I gotta ask you, have you defined abundance? And second, I think we might
Wealth.
have like
What's wealth?
right
What's wealth?
from its literal science, right, from literal science. A second, I would say like there's another dimension that is always like lost here, that is the dimension of race and also ethnicities. So there's different like composition, there's different formulas in different places of the world, and like in places like South Africa, or I mean Latin America, the role of race is always like a part of this whole formula, and that kind of complicates the relations between what you have just mentioned, between this abundance and cultural and so-called like social liberalism. So I think the easiest way to figure out this whole formula is to go back to these Western countries, see how these two things interact, and then you go to and then you add this like race factors into this whole like algorithm and see how it changes. So what I see is that I don't think social liberalism is a necessary, has to happen after economic prosperity. And like, I don't think there is something that is have this like kind of this decisive like role like in between, or say causality in between. Although I do agree that now it is somehow related, but I think it's a matter of like globalization. It's this part of this social process in which interdependence, interconnectedness has taken over this nation state. This singular ways of thinking of things.
No, but
So
you see, but I think you're making it too easy for yourself. So okay, so wealth, I think, is correlated with a particular social structure. So that is to say, um, wealth is about individualism, right? So it's this idea that okay, so I go to school, I get a degree, I get a job, but at the job, okay, maybe I'm a slave while I'm working, but when you sort of go home and you're relatively free, because you choose the networks that you hang out with. So even if your neighbor in an apartment building is very conservative, but you might not have to interact with that neighbor. You can just go and to I don't know, like a yoga class, and then you meet the people over there and you befriend them, and then through that you develop greater level of tolerance and openness and cosmopolitanism. While I mean, like poverty is correlated with what? I mean, it's a lifestyle of a farmer, ultimately, right? It's about so you have a plot of land, and then you work the field, and you only meet your neighbors, who are also farmers, and there's a you know there's a degree of social conservatism that is associated with that kind of lifestyle. And I mean, of course, Marx wrote about this. I mean, and he used very nasty words about farmers, which I'm not going to quote here. But yeah, I mean, so right. So I think wealth is connected with a particular social structure. Like farming versus urban households. And then that social structure is connected with with ideology. I mean, your views about conservatism versus liberalism, and so yeah. I mean, if you say that this connection is BS, then you're basically dissing the entire sociological.
Well, of course not. Of course not. But like
apparatus.
Right. But like a lot like I see where you're going, and in line with that, like I have to mention the interesting nuances between exploitation and expropriation. you get this exploitation that derives from certain social structure, that is upon the uneven attribution of like wealth, social wealth, economic wealth, whatever you define it. But at the same time, you also have this expatriation by which state power kind of like allocates the status of individual citizens. And that is not only a thing in the urbanized world, this is also a thing in agrarian like economy. And these two things sometimes relate with one another. So by talking about the wealth and the social structure that underlies it, we kind of like get away from the role of the state and the role of status in this whole formula. So of course, like exploitation is there. Of course, there's this kind of like distribution, problem out going on. But you can't say it's a one-sided effect of this exploitation class, right? It's, you got to stay there, and these two things are sometimes like combined with one another, and that's something to me is very concerning, because like it's not like okay. So do you think state is always against capital? Where like sometimes the capital and the state can help one another, building like a city state, like I don't know, like Singapore or Hong Kong. If that's the case, then like you can't really like isolate economic dimension as this decisive dimension in this whole formula. Like there is something else.
Yeah. So basically, you're saying, well, Singapore's rich and conservative, and not rich and
Yeah.
liberal as with the Western countries. Okay. And yeah. So I'm not an expert in Singapore political economy. I know that the rhetorically, at the very least, the level of oppressiveness that the state shows to its citizens, is lessening over time. Now, I mean, it's not perfect in any case. I mean, for instance, when they appointed the leader of the opposition of the Workers' Party, which is the biggest opposition party in Singapore.
Right.
But even there, I mean, the Workers' Party only ran in like 20 out of 100 constituencies, so they were never going to be able to form the majority government. And the People's Action Party, which is the ruling government, would probably never allow them to. But there is a movement now towards opening up and liberalizing, and I think over time that pressure is increasing. And as long as also in mainland China, I mean, as long as the economic situation was improving for the Chinese people, I think that there is going to be pressure to gradually liberalize, at least in not in politics, but in the social, in the civic sphere. And for a while it was laissez-faire, but now it's turning the other way around. But also the economy is now suffering since this COVID meltdown, I guess.
I mean, like this kind of this kind of logic, with all respect, it just kind of echoes. First of all, like modernization theory, which we all know. It's like second, it kind of like it's the same as typical neoliberal logic, right? You get like you give people rights, you let them grow economically, and over time you get democratic system, and you somehow like complement one another, like eventually have this westernized democracy. But the point is, like, I'm simply like I'm not totally like I don't know, like disappointed about this rhetoric, but what I'm a little bit like concerned is a rhetoric that under this formula of economic prosperity, we have to give up this like progressive values, like we have to function as a family, like in its most traditional
Right. So
sense.
it's authoritarian capitalism. That's the sort of vision.
For me, it's neoliberal. It's neoliberalism. It's the same two sides of the same
Well, I
coin.
mean, when it's
Yeah.
liberalism, I mean, so the neoliberal is actually, I think, quite socially progressive. I mean, would probably be in favor of abortion, would be in favor of gay rights and all these things. I mean, they'd probably be finding arrangements with those social issues. The only thing that the neoliberals don't want is social democracy, right? Like basically allowing um, political officials to redistribute income from the rich to the poor, I guess.
I guess what I guess there is a interesting nuance here. Like we have different like conception of neoliberalism, because like for me it's like uh, rather than saying that neoliberalism like approve or say like permit the existence of this kind of like progressive values, I would rather say they just don't really care. And if you see like how this so-called like neoliberal agenda like is laid out, essentially it's not about like improving or the situation of these things. It's quite the opposite. And actually, I was convinced by Melinda Cooper. Yeah, but she had made this argument that like what neoliberal leads to is actually social conservatism. And by doing that, she kind of like reinterpret this bipartisan politics in US and how it still like work till nowadays. Although you see it's kind of they've divided country, but actually like you get this new liberal like Democrats and you get this like new conservative like Republicans. Although like I'm generalizing, I'm overly generalizing right now. I know like, but like this kind of thing still kind of converge. It's simply because they're trying to promote this like the same agenda. Like look at what's going on like in US Congress. The only thing that unify two parties is China because they both hate it. At least they pretend to hate it, right?
Yeah. So on the point of neoliberalism produces conservatism, yes, I agree with that because so I'm also influenced by Karl Polanyi, and then
But there are different interpretations about planning.
yeah, I mean, so in the Polanyian framework, basically, the more marketization you introduce,
right.
the more social destabilization, and then the more social destabilization, the more people crave
Yeah, I agree with
the
this direction.
security.
Yeah, I agree with this direction.
And then security is provided through the nation state. So that's where the nationalist framework comes from. Because the problem with the neoliberal politicians, facing economic insecurities, low wage jobs, precarious jobs, Uber jobs, etc. Their reply is keep grinding, work harder, good luck. And the nationalist response is we're going to protect you if you're a citizen of this country, and we're going to kick out the foreigners, right? So America first, right? We're going to build the wall.
Right.
But I mean, even the European discourse, for many years has been like this. Like get the immigrants out, and we're going to take care of our own people.
Right.
It ends up being bullshit because the first problem is that nationalists. So they always attack the political establishment. But they say, well, because we're outsiders, we're not part of the political establishment. Vote out these corrupt bastards, put us in charge, and we're going to clean house. The problem is that when they get into power,
they're the same. They're not make no
even worse. They're even worse. because so if you're like the old elite, yes, there's graft, yes, there's corruption, but it's like routinized. It's kind of like a routinized form of corruption, right?
Right.
But if you have new guys that come in, it's almost like now we're going to rewrite the social contract of corruption, of graft. That is to say, we're going to do even bigger and even worse, because we were excluded before the election, right? Before we won the election, we were always opposition, we could never, I don't know, we could never enjoy the graft. And now that we're in, we're like, now we go full in. We're going to be even more badass, corrupt, people.
And
Leaders.
you studied like automation, so I'm pretty sure you know a lot of like stories like about this, right? Like that's one of the fields in the whole like I think like most industrialized countries that is truly impacted by this
You're right. So the
the
issue is
race of automation, yeah,
that they're
and
being that
nationalist.
they're being more corrupt, the right wing populist leaders. And then the other thing is, like, even if they realize the policies, right? Okay, so we're going to do a migration stop. Well, guess what's I mean, look at what's happening with Brexit. I mean, you have basically, empty supermarket shelves because they can't hire
Right.
the EU truck drivers
Mm-hmm.
to come drive over to the UK because you have to fill out these freaking customs forms and crossing the English Channel, right?
For
Um,
me, I totally I like the way you're going, and like I don't think we have too much differences in here. And like I simply want to give you like another point, like to see if you see it as feasible or not. Like I mentioned about this current consensus in U.S. politics, that is to fence off like a growing China, and like I think China here, as same as uh, the rhetoric in take back control during Brexit, the China almost equals to Poles or Eastern Europeans in that campaign. You get China here is not about Beijing as a political entity. It's more about race and ethnicity, and that's something that's truly concerning. I mean, like if you think about it, if you, the way in which these political campaigns are conducted, not only in the US but also in Europe, kind of like construct this China in this most racist and most like ethnic way. It's like constructing as like a typical the other. It's the same as what it was done like in late 19th century. So it's if they really care about what's going on in Beijing politically, things could be much better. That's basically my point. So like this thing, I think it originates is like even before Obama, I don't know, but I think like you can find some empirical evidence like in Obama era. So like they don't know what's going on in China. Instead, still construct something about like pivoting to Asia, whatever. Like this is they are missing this point here. They're missing the point here. They don't know what's going on in that political regime, in that like their calculation, as same as they don't know anything about what's going on like in Putin's world. And that's something I think is quite concerning.
Yeah, so the racialization is a problem. I mean, I remember when at the height of the lockdown in 2020
Mhm.
and COVID, I mean, you had Asian Americans that are being attacked, and I mean, it's very interesting. I mean, you had Filipinos and Japanese and Koreans, and I mean, they were being attacked as well, right? Because they have the same,
Yeah. Yeah.
physical features as the
Mhm.
Chinese, right? So I mean, it's not even. I mean, so I mean, among the sort of like the crude racists,
Mhm.
yeah, looking Asian, looking East Asian
Mhm.
is enough to be a target for hate.
Mhm.
But I think you're targeting something else here, which is, is there a possibility of racial animosity? I mean, even at the higher the policy levels,
Right.
uh, and I not sure how differentiated the West looks at it. I think there's some differentiation here
Mhm.
where at least at the policymaker level, I mean, they're
Mhm.
saying, well, we're fighting the Cold War with China. Let's say with the rulers in China.
Mhm.
And I mean, we also have to say, I mean, that the way how you know the U.S. National security establishment works is that they always have to fight an enemy.
Mm-hmm.
So ever since the U.S. became the global superpower with the
Mm-hmm.
end of World War II, okay,
Mm-hmm.
well, we're fighting the Soviet Union. Then the Soviet Union collapsed, so you had maybe 10
Mm-hmm.
years of the Fukuyama bullshit, you could call it, maybe. But then you had 9/11, right?
Yeah.
And then with 9/11, they were like, okay, we're going to fight this long war with Islamic countries and
Right,
terrorism,
right,
basically.
right.
But now, I mean, it's very interesting. I recently saw this. There was some national security official in America, and he was interviewed, and he was like, the the strategic enemy is no longer in the Middle East. That's the whole point of the Afghanistan withdrawal, right? It's about putting an
Mm-hmm.
end to that
Mm-hmm.
period in history,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and the new chapter is all about China,
Mm-hmm.
fighting China. Now, the thing is that, um, but then the year after, of course, Ukraine happened. So now Ukraine happened, and so and the Americans are sending more soldiers to Europe, right, to build
Mm-hmm.
the eastern flank, Eastern Europe.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so, but I mean, I don't know. It's like this international relations is incredibly messy, right? It's like,
I mean, but like we can kind of divert from international relations and like look at as what we're doing right now, like from the perspective of sociology, and it kind of like echoes what you talked like a little bit earlier today. Bill mentioned this like the dynamic in Roe versus Wade and the interesting like Supreme Court like politics that derives from Marbury versus Madison and evolve along the way. And you mentioned this interesting relationship between now I have to rephrase it like between space, I mean, and norms, or say like power. Like it depends on what you are trying to talk to. Like it's just very interesting for me personally to look at this, for example, the involvement of this like department settings inside US administration, like structure. For example, if you can open the website of like State Department, and you can see have this like the lower level of this like State Department structure. It is basically established upon some like geographical like differences. At the same time, you can see like the race and ethnicity is part of that, right? Like you get like this so-called Eastern Europe, which is basically about like the Europeans other than West Europeans, right? And like by saying about Eastern Europeans, that means okay, so they are basically categorized as folks who are partly or historically subscribed to socialism and Soviet influence, and like as well, we can also see how they structure the resources about East Asia. So it's basically about the same like racial line. Yeah. So it's I think it has played a role, a very interesting role in the decision making level, and it can somehow like blurs the things like because like in East Asia you have Japan, you have China, you have like Taiwan, like all of them are like ordered differently. And if you see like the influence of Japanese occupation in Taiwan, that somehow shapes the identity of Taiwan. But like if you like if from like Washington, if you see it from this racial and ethnic line, you will lose a lot of information. You will lose this the point here. And actually, I think that is the point that Beijing has been taking advantage of. You know, do you remember like in 1990s when Jiang Zemin visited like Washington? He played a lot of this cultural relativism. You know, he's played a lot of this Confucianism, this Chinese culture stuff. There are some researchers about it, very interesting. Like you see how at that time, because like China was very at that time very eager to become a part of global economic system. So they're saying, okay, we play with you, but although like we have different rules because we have this so-called Confucius tradition, And by doing that, it kind of conflates the line between Chinese and Japanese and other like Koreans, other like at that time rather developed Eastern Asian economies. You have to say Jiang is a very smart guy, but he played that. You see, Bill Clinton doesn't really have a way against him. Like he was like totally lost. He was like, all right, yeah, we have to respect some ethnic codes.
Well, Jiang Zemin was very cultured because he spoke English. He cited the Gettysburg Address.
And I think most of all, like have we Westerners think he play against us and he play with us. And eventually he play over us. Like that's his trick. But I mean, like nowadays, it's sometimes easier to see this whole game because like you don't have such sophisticated Chinese leaders. So like it's rather like more clear and simple right now. It's like you basically can calculate like where she is going. Yeah, it's not that different from like because for me, I think I was a kid. I wasn't like grown up when Jiang Zemin was in power. I didn't know. I couldn't remember. So like if I see it as a hindsight nowadays, I think he's making some very unexpected moves. You don't know where he's going. But I definitely know where Xi Jinping is going. It's like as you do, right? Like you have a lot of like predictions, calculations, because basically now how Xi ticks. He's got his own calculation in his own way.
Well, the main issue that he puts the world community on edge is his decision on Taiwan. I mean, this is really, I think, the crucial matter. I mean, and it's really the Chinese side that determines the future of it because I mean, from the Taiwanese side, I mean, they were already clear. I mean, we are not going to declare the Republic of Taiwan. I mean, we're going to keep the current designation, even at the cost of diplomatic exclusion or diplomatic marginalization. And they would have been fine with sticking with the status quo. And I think that's the smartest thing that a small state can do. But it's really the machinations, the thinking of the big state that really matters. I mean, I talked to one Chinese person who was, about whether the Ukraine war was heightening or decreasing the likelihood for the Taiwan invasion. He said, "No, I think it's going to be declining." He said, because. I guess maybe it was very hopeful to say that because the idea being that the world can only face one major crisis at a time. That's sort of
all right.
attention span thing.
So he's like Chinese, right? Like Chinese. That's understandable because he's like in a foreign country. Of course, he doesn't really want like China to be like part of this major crisis. I think it will jeopardize.
Yeah, but he thinks that it will still eventually happen, right? He thinks that the invasion will happen within Xi's lifetime. Yeah, but I don't know. I mean, the other argument would be that China might strike now because of the Ukraine war, because to some extent. So right now, what's happening is that the Americans are shipping their surplus weapon stock to Ukraine, and so it takes time to replenish like Javelin missiles and Habermas and all of these.
Or put it simply, that they don't think U.S. can fight these two wars at the same time, right? Like although like theoretically that is U.S. has been preparing to do, but like in reality, I think that a lot of Chinese believe that it is impossible. So they have to take advantage of this current situation.
That's right.
Yeah,
so right now, I mean, the US is at the weakest. Yeah. And the whole, the whole assumption behind the Taiwanese defense. I mean, there was an CNN interview with Tsai Ing-wen. And she was very open about it. I mean, she's like about the defense strategy. She was like, the Taiwanese armed forces are strong enough to hold out for 1 week. And then after that week, they hope, well, that there's, Western sanctions, that there is, that the Americans can mobilize the fleet to come in and protect the Taiwanese.
Or in 1 week, I mean, from what I've been working with, I think the renminbi will collapse. like it's not like Russia, like China's not like Russia. I think 1 week, if you talk to like political economists, like they will believe it is sufficient for coerced, we'll say orchestrated move against Chinese economic power. It is enough. 1 week is totally enough. Like if you try to like bankrupt China, it's enough. It's not like Russia. Like Russia can shut it down.
So what's your calculation that the Chinese hold the reserves in the West? I mean, in the US?
It's more about reserves. Like a lot of that's actually one of the part of the presentation I made in SASA. So like a lot of people have paid attention to the role of reserve in renminbi's alignment with US dollars and other foreign currencies. But there's another like a more important factor, in my own opinion, that is always overlooked. So like in this past 20 years, a lot of like this Chinese firms have listed their shares in international stock market, at the same time issuing corporate debts in major financial hubs like Singapore, like Hong Kong. And most of them are state-owned enterprise, like Chinese National Petro something. I don't know the full name of that, some petrol firms, some chemical firms. And like whenever there's some big like geopolitical crisis, letting alone like Taiwan, I mean, that's just too big. I mean, if there's some geopolitical crisis happening, I'm pretty sure that the corporate debts in these places will be worked against, to put it simply. You get enough like international hedge fund managers, enough investment bankers at this time to move against them. And at the time of the collapse of this corporate debts will be much faster than the time it takes to exhaust China's foreign reserve. And actually, like if you see it, like it will easily push China into a North Korean-like economy. And I think 1 week is enough. You don't need 1 week, 3 days. Enough.
Yeah, but I mean, so there's also a difference between Russia and China because China is a much bigger global economy,
Yeah.
and they have much more of the supply chains being integrated with the West. I mean, it seems to me that like Russia is sort of like, well, I mean, it's a petro economy, so it's got big, energy companies and contracts with the European countries. But all the other parts of the economy, outside of Rosneft and Gazprom, is very, very tiny. I mean, the economic impacts of like doing the sanctioning is much heavier on Russia than it is on the West. But I feel like, I mean, if the West wants to deploy financial warfare on China, it will be much, much more painful to the West. I mean, like, so right now, I mean, if you look, for instance, with the COVID lockdown, the zero COVID, and the ships are backed up in the ports of Shanghai, and you can see like we have crazy inflation all over the West, right? I mean, in Europe as well as North America, and it's because if the supply ships are not leaving Chinese ports, then our shelves are going to be empty, right?
Yeah.
And so then what are we going to do? So okay, well, now.
Well, look, there's another thing. I'm sorry, but I gotta highlight this. So, if you're aware of this terminology, like I think I'd rather put it like in this modern English as this like investment class. But I mean, a lot of like old style like German sociologists would try to call it like rentiers, like this French word. Yeah, so basic investment class, the people who gain their income from this, like the ownership of property and other assets in the international financial market. And there's a great difference between Russians rentier and Chinese rentier. Like the latter is very much internationalized. So I think the contingency will lie at the composition of so-called this Chinese rentier. When there's a so-called as you put it, when there's like economic shock or like some kind of geopolitical crisis, and there might be some sanctions that follow. I think like the case scenario, the best case scenario in Russia will be to exhaust these like rentiers and eventually pushing forward this like Russians elites to go against one another. But in China's case, whenever there's a sanction, a more likely scenario will be a division of this rentiers, a division of this investment class. You will have this pro-West investment class, and you will have this pro-Beijing investment class. And by doing that, you might somehow divide China from within. And that is, I think, like by talking about the devastation of like sanction against China, a lot of people might overlook the possibility of China's division from within, and the possibility of a fraction inside this China's political elites that would rather choose to go with West instead of go with like the most conservative fraction in Beijing. Yeah, I think that is. Maybe I'm already optimistic.
Well,
I don't know.
the question is whether that division is sufficient to threaten the regime itself. Because,
Yeah,
for
that's
instance,
true.
I mean,
That's true. Yeah.
in the Russian case, I mean, the answer is no. It's not enough.
Yeah.
Because the problem is the way how the Russian political economy is designed. I mean, think of a pyramid, right? So
Right.
you have Putin at the very top, and and the oligarchs are basically, Putin's personal accountants, right? So they're basically they're like Putin's money managers. Like they're given the. I mean, of course, they can have like the mansion and whatever French Riviera and whatever else, and they're very wealthy themselves for sure. But they're only given this kind of access to the wealth because of Putin's concession. And then the very few oligarchs from the Yeltsin era, like Mikhail Khodorkovsky, Boris Berezovsky. You can read the history, the biography, what happened to them.
Right.
Khodorkovsky was in jail for 10 years. He's now in exile. Berezovsky, British exile, he was assassinated. Right. So basically, you don't really have these anti-Putin oligarchs anymore. There were some oligarchs who spoke out against the Ukraine war, but then they quickly quieted down after that. And there were some oligarchs who actually were assassinated since the Ukraine war.
Oh, yeah.
So I think the way how the Russian oligarchs set up is, I mean, they are an extraordinarily short leash to the Kremlin. That's why the opposition to Putin, I think, can only come from the Siloviki, the security establishment,
right,
intelligence agencies and the military, basically. It's not going to come from the oligarchs. With China, I'm not sure, because I mean,
yeah, I'm also not sure. Trust me, like that's a good question, and I don't know the answer. Yeah, and like if you're working, I don't know if you're still like working in this economic sociology anymore. Like there were some discussion about state managed capitalism and the state asset manager in China about like 10 years ago, and there were some empirical works about that. But I don't know, especially like after COVID, after this Xi Jinping's like this anti-corruption campaign, how to what extent this kind of consolidation still exists, and if there's still some kind of like fractions that try to go against Xi himself. I don't really know. Like, yeah, that's a good question. And to be honest, like, yeah, that's will be, I think, the decisive element in determining China's future in this potential economic crisis, or say like geopolitical catastrophe. And who knows? I mean,
Well, Leo Tolstoy used to say, all happy families are the same. All unhappy
oh yeah.
families are unhappy in their own ways. And I guess what it means in today's world is, as long as the economic, political times are good, I think, the leader is fine. Um, if the times are going bad, then, then you're going to have the chaos. You're going to have the
Right.
multiple factions building up and going to oppose the regime. That's one of the reasons why I, with all the reservations about democratic systems, vote Trump, Brexit, and all these things, I still prefer procedurally democratic system, because at the very least, you can get rid of bad leaders. I mean, you cannot really vote in good leaders, right? That's difficult, but you can always get rid of bad leaders. Well, I think in authoritarian countries, the problem is that, I mean, if your current leader is bad, you either have to accept it, and then you hope that after that guy dies, the next one is better, or you have to organize a revolution. I mean, which is bloody and difficult, and so
yeah.
Yeah, but then I don't know. I mean, then I hear the flip side argument. I mean, if you look, for instance, the high-speed rail network, the infrastructure projects in China. I mean, it's very fast, very efficient, because they don't have any opposition. I mean, you can't have people that are blocking what the party leaders call progress, right? So. Yeah, so every system comes, with the good and the bad, but you know, but if I had to make a choice, I would still think that democratic systems is a little bit more resilient.
Yeah, of course, yeah. And like, actually, I'm not an expert in democracy theories, and I think like the term democracy itself is very controversial. So I tend not to talk too much about that term, because I think it's very misleading at times, to talk about democracy, because different people have different like definition about it. And like, of course, I think like direct democracy is problematic, and that is something I'm never like, this problematic thing is something I've never doubted with. But at the same time, like I rather to frame it like another way. I think it's very important to live in a system where the so-called like heterodoxy, the dissidents, the people who have different opinions, or people who are considered as the abnormal of the whole, still have a voice, to have a chance, to have an opportunity. I think that is something that is truly matters.
Pluralism,
And
basically, yeah. Pluralism,
right,
liberalism,
exactly.
yeah. I mean,
And
those are
also
the
like,
values.
by talk, same as like your point about like infrastructures. I think I tweeted like very short. I think rather than talking about the achievement of this Chinese system, I think Westerners ourselves should question about the way in which investments, the way in which like finance is done in our countries. Why we can't really find enough finance to do an infrastructure program, right? Like why the money goes to hedge funds, go to like senseless like investments, instead of some program that truly enhance the well-being of all. And I think it's a matter of like institutional design, and it's a matter of like also the other dynamics that follow. I will not attribute this, the success of Chinese infrastructure, to Chinese system. I think there's something else. And yeah, right? So like the reason we don't really have high-speed railroad is not because like we don't have a Chinese system. It's because we kind of craft a capital market that is operating very wrongly. I think that's the point. And to put it better, like to make it better, I think we need to have a better capital market instead of copying Chinese model. I think that's something that is truly matters, I believe.
Yeah. So the thing about pluralistic democratic rule of law, I mean, all of these things, is that you will have to accommodate and compromise, and you have to like, so for instance, okay, with the high speed rail, I mean, what's one of the key issues? The key issue is, can you convince private landowners to surrender a piece of the property in order to build the railroad tracks, the infrastructure? And and in democratic rule of law societies, the answer is much more difficult to do that than it is in authoritarian states, where you don't have the veto players. So I think this. Now, so you can still build. Of course, you can build railroads in democratic societies too. I mean, it's just that it's a consensual process that that takes time and deliberation. And but then the advantage about in democracies is that the slowness, they compensate with perhaps like resoluteness, like once they have made a decision. So or at least that's the hope. I mean, so if you look, for instance, at this anti-Russia coalition of the West, which was very strong in the early months of the invasion, and today at the government level it is still relatively strong. But the question is, I mean, if Putin plays his gas card now, because now is the only time he can play it, because in 2 years the Germans build the LNG ports and then it's over. This is a big question. So if the apartments in Europe are going to stay cold in the winter, no gas, no heat, will the anti-Russia coalition fall apart? Will the European voters pressure their governments to surrender Ukraine?
I mean, I have to like. I mean, I'm curious. I guess I'm trying to before I try to talk share my thoughts about this. I think I can offer an alternative in this so-called infrastructure questions, because I think this is something that is not fully theorized like in the current discussions. Like actually the first country with this cross-continent railroad is US, that kind of combines like the East and the West. And it is also like miracle in infrastructure. The way that US made it possible is through a massive corporate power. At that time, the corporate that construct this whole railway, actually there are two of them, had this immense capital from so at that time so-called investment bankers, and also have this almost absolute advantage when it's negotiating with this adjacent property owners. So actually US, actually the capitalist system is the first one. It was a democratic system, however you define it. This system is the first one that craft this kind of infrastructural miracle, not Chinese system. So by talking about welfare, we can kind of deliver through democratic system. Perhaps we should think about the new ways of building so-called capital market. We're building this capital constellation, so to speak. When the government's trying to build this railroad, do have new ways, innovative ways to negotiate with the property owners alongside this rail. You can, for example, participate through owning my shares. You can perhaps like and try to convince them with a profits instead of talking about confiscation, talking about property rules. I think it's a matter of innovation. I think it happens sometimes. It's not like a one-sided road. It's not you have to be like authoritarian. That's the only way you become prosperous. I think like in democratic system, we have better chance. And that's first thing first. So like by talking about this like anti-Russia coalition, I think one of this very problematic logic that the whole West is falling into is the logic of sanction, because I think it's not a logic that fully collaborate with the logic of capitalism. I think instead of beating Russia through making it hungry, making it like devastated, the better way is look at the one of the few success in capitalism's history. That is what happened in East and West Germany. You have to outperform. You have to make sure that this side of the world lives a better life than the other side. And current ways of working against Russia is problematic, partly because this sanction is a zero-sum game. European countries are only losing in cheap gas. They're not gaining anything in at least like economically. And that is, I think, the one of these problems of this design of the sanction network. If we somehow like evolve like Arabic countries, Saudi Arabia, although because of human rights issues, there are some, of course, like reluctance. If it evolves,
now the human rights is no longer a problem. I mean, the
yeah,
Europeans
now
don't
they're
care
shaking
anymore.
hands. Now they're shaking hands. I know,
Yeah,
but like
they
we
need the
have to
gas.
develop a better system, like insofar that Russians' production of gas is outperformed. And that is a better way of bankrupt Russia rather than like restraining us from participating global financial system. I mean, that's something I learned from like this, like Nicholas Luhmann. If you're trying to save a problem, restraining isn't the best answer. You got to like make yourself like abundant.
It's about creating energy independence from Russia for Europe. That's the goal.
And you got to involve more producers other than like restraining Russia from entering the market. That will be a very, very bad solution.
Well, that's
I
what the
don't know.
Americans tried. I mean, I think they concluded the Iran nuclear deal because Iran is a major exporter of oil. They want to restore relations with Venezuela because the Americans used to support the opposition leader as the rightful leader of the country, so and now Biden visited in Saudi Arabia, right?
Right. We just saw
Like
that.
after attacking, the Saudis for the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, who was living in, I guess, in America at that time. And now all of a sudden, oh, this is not a problem anymore. It's like, yeah, because we need the gas. We need your gas. Okay. Yeah, and that is the right way to do it. But again, from a European perspective, I mean, they need 2 years to figure this out. So
Yeah.
For 2 years, I mean, Putin will play his card, and the question really is, I mean, are the Europeans okay with taking the cold shower in a cold apartment?
Are you sure? As someone who just came back from Vienna, do you think it is possible? I mean, I'm not that optimistic, but I'm quite optimistic about the future of this like joint efforts of bringing in Saudi, bringing in Venezuela into this whole picture. That's something I'm quite optimistic. But if you talk about this, the public opinion, I'm not that optimistic. Yeah, maybe I share your concern about democracy in your terms. I'm not optimistic, but I don't know. Like, I mean, just as this old Chinese saying has put it, maybe live in interesting times. This
that,
is interesting times, right?
that's definitely what is certainly happening. Okay, so I think we'll bring the podcast to an end now.
Right.
And thank you very much, Francis, for your time.
Thank you.
And I also thank my listeners. I hope that there's a good source of entertainment today.
Hopefully it is.
Yeah, hopefully it is.
Yeah.
Okay.